Hey there, come on in, get settled. Pull that blanket up a little higher if you need to. I am so glad you found your way back here tonight. Wherever you're watching, from whatever kind of day you just crawled out of, you made it to this quiet little corner of the internet, and that already means something. So take a breath. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears. Tonight we're going somewhere unusual together, somewhere written not in old letters or crumbling stone, but inside your own body, in a language older than any word ever spoken. Somewhere on a quiet street in a city you have probably never thought twice about, a scientist sat alone in front of a glowing screen at 2 a.m, staring at a number that should not have existed. It was not a number about money or war or some ancient king. It was a number buried inside human deoxyribonucleic acid, the very thread that built every hair on your head and every tooth in your mouth. And that number was so extreme, so wildly outside anything she had ever measured before, that her first thought was not wonder. It was fear that her machine had simply broken. Before we slip into that story, let me ask a small favour, and only if tonight's journey ends up being the kind of company you were hoping for. If you find yourself relaxing into this, if the sound of my voice starts to feel like something familiar rather than something new, consider tapping that little heart or thumbs up wherever it sits on your screen. Following along or subscribing costs you nothing, but helps this small series keep finding its way to more tired minds like yours. And if a thought crosses your mind while you listen, drop it below afterward. I always wonder who is out there in the dark with me. Are you tucked into bed in some little apartment in Ohio? Are you driving home late from a shift you wish had ended hours ago? Are you rocking a baby back to sleep in the next room? Tell me where you are and what time it is where you are, because knowing that we are sharing this moment together across all that distance is honestly one of my favourite parts of doing this now. If you can turn the big light off and let something soft take its place instead, a lamp in the corner, maybe a fan humming nearby for that gentle, steady background sound. Let the room feel like a place where a story is about to be told, not a place where anything else is expected of you. Good. Now let's begin. Her name was Pardis Sabeti, and in the early winter of 2006 she was not chasing pharaohs or lost cities. She was chasing something far stranger. She wanted to catch evolution in the act, to find the exact spots in the human genetic code where nature had, within just the last few tens of thousands of years, reached in and rewritten something about us on purpose. Most of our deoxyribonucleic acid drifts along quietly unbothered, carried forward generation after generation with no particular pressure pushing it one way or another. But every so often a single change appears that gives the person carrying it some tiny advantage. Maybe they survive a hunger their neighbour does not. Maybe they raise one more surviving child. And when that happens, that little change does not stay rare. It spreads faster and faster, sweeping through an entire population like a rumour nobody can stop repeating. Picture the room for a moment, because you're about to spend the rest of tonight in it with her. A cramped university office in Cambridge, Massachusetts, a radiator ticking somewhere behind a crowded bookshelf, the rest of the building folded into darkness around her. Her coffee had gone cold hours earlier, forgotten beside a tall stack of printouts. Outside her window, the last of the autumn leaves were finally giving up and drifting onto an empty sidewalk. None of that mattered to her right then. Just a keyboard, a humming machine, and endless rows of letters, 4 of them repeating over and over in every possible combination. A T, C, and G, the whole alphabet nature ever needed to build every single one of us. Finding those sweeps buried inside 3 billion genetic letters is a bit like standing on a beach and trying to spot the 1 grain of sand that arrived yesterday. So Sabeti and her colleagues built a kind of mathematical net, a way of scanning the human genome and flagging any stretch of genetic code that looked unusually suspiciously uniform across huge numbers of people, the genetic fingerprint left behind when something spreads too fast to have happened by chance alone. Think of it a little like the way one particular song can take over an entire high school within a single month. At the start of the month, almost nobody has heard it. By the end, it is drifting out of every locker, every car window, every study hall, until a version of the world where that song did not exist feels almost impossible to picture. Evolution moves at a far slower, far quieter pace, stretched across thousands of years instead of weeks. But the underlying shape of the pattern is oddly familiar. Something small begins, something gives it an edge, and before long it seems to be everywhere at once. And late that winter, one signal came back that made her stop scrolling completely. It sat on a gene called EDAR short for the ectodysplasin A receptor gene tucked away on chromosome 2. In East Asian populations, the strength of that signal was not just strong. It was one of the single strongest signatures of recent natural selection ever recorded anywhere in the human genome. For a moment, sitting there in the near dark with nothing but her monitor's glow and a cooling mug of tea beside her, she honestly wondered if her software had glitched. Real biological signals are almost never that clean, that sharp, that unmistakable. Nature usually leaves messy fingerprints, not a signature this precise. But she checked it again and again. The signal held. Here is where the story turns from strange numbers into something you can actually reach up and touch, because you are wearing the evidence right now, whether or not it happens to apply to you personally. Inside EDAR sits a tiny single-letter typo, a spot, where one chemical building block sits in place of another. Scientists later gave it the name V372A, which sounds cold and clinical, but stick with me, because what it actually does is anything but boring. That single letter helps steer how a developing embryo builds its skin and everything that grows out of skin. Hair follicles, sweat glands, teeth, even the tissue that will one day form mammary glands. One small switch flipped early in development, and the ripples spread outward into a dozen different parts of the body at once. In people who carry this particular version of the letter, hair tends to grow noticeably thicker and straighter, with a wider shaft under a microscope than hair without the variant. Front teeth often come in with a subtle scoop carved into the back surface, a shape dentists call shoveling something so consistent that anthropologists have used it for decades to help sort human remains by ancestry. Forensic specialists still lean on that small architectural detail today, one clue among several when trying to work out where an unidentified skeleton's ancestors likely came from long before any laboratory test can confirm a thing. A shape smaller than a grain of rice quietly holding part of a story no gravestone ever recorded. And skin across the body tends to carry a higher density of sweat glands, more of those tiny pores working to cool a person down on a hot day. Now here is the part that still makes me sit back a little. This one letter, this one change is carried by somewhere around 90% of people with East Asian and indigenous American ancestry today. And in people of European or African ancestry, it is almost entirely absent, showing up in only a small handful of individuals out of many. One version of one gene, essentially universal on one side of the old world, essentially unseen on the other. That is not a small cultural difference or a fashion trend passed down through generations. That is deep biology carried silently inside cells for tens of thousands of years, completely unrelated to anything anyone chose or decided. Think about that for a second, maybe even reach up and run your fingers through your own hair while you do. If you've ever stood in front of a bathroom mirror wondering why your hair refuses to hold a curl, no matter how much product you use, or why a friend's hair does the exact opposite and will not stay straight for love or money, part of that story traces all the way back to this one gene, quietly doing its work in the background of a decision your body made long before you ever took a breath. Hairstylists have plenty of opinions about all of this, understandably. Biology worked out its own answer tens of thousands of years earlier. So when did this all begin? Later genetic dating work building on Sabeti's original discovery pointed to somewhere around 30 to 35,000 years ago as the moment this variant first appeared, likely somewhere in East Asia. And then, sometime after the brutal peak of the last ice age, as temperatures finally began easing, and populations started expanding again, it took off. It spread through generation after generation, with a speed that still leaves researchers a little breathless when they model it out on paper. But here is a question that probably just crossed your mind because it is the same one that nagged at scientists for years afterward. Finding a signal on a computer screen is one thing. Proving that a single genetic letter truly reshapes a living, breathing body is an entirely different, much harder task. A signal could be a coincidence. It could be tangled up with some other nearby gene doing the real work. Correlation is cheap. Real proof takes something bolder. So roughly 7 years later, a researcher named Yana Kambarov, working alongside Sabeti, and a developmental biologist named Clifford Tabin at Harvard, decided to settle the question in about as direct a way as science allows. They took the EDAR variant and engineered it into laboratory mice, giving ordinary mice this one human genetic change and nothing else. Then they waited. Genetics never hands over its verdict quickly. Litters had to be born. Pups had to grow old enough for their fur and their tiny paws to reveal whatever the experiment had actually done, if anything at all. It is an odd kind of patient sitting with a cage of ordinary laboratory mice waiting for an answer to a question that first began with human hair on the far side of the world. And the mice changed. Their fur grew thicker and straighter. Their sweat glands, which mice barely have to begin with, increased in number in the paw pads, the one place mice actually do sweat. Even their mammary tissue shifted subtly in structure. Researchers running a gentle hand along the animals' backs could feel the difference, before any measurement ever confirmed it. A coat noticeably coarser and straighter than an ordinary laboratory mouse had any business having. A single borrowed letter from the human genome dropped into an entirely different species, and the body followed the same blueprint anyway. That is about as near to a smoking gun as biology ever hands you. It was not a coincidence sitting quietly on a screen anymore. It was a small, furry, undeniable piece of proof running around in a laboratory cage in Boston, carrying a fragment of an ancient human story inside its own tiny body. I have to admit there is something almost tender about that image once you sit with it for a moment. A change that first appeared in a human being on the cold plains of ancient East Asia, tens of thousands of years before anyone could write a single word down, ended up recreating itself faithfully inside a mouse in a research building thousands of years later on the other side of the planet. Nothing about biology cares how much time has passed. The instructions just keep doing exactly what they have always done. Somewhere around 35,000 years ago, one single human being was born carrying a slightly different genetic letter than everyone around them. That person never knew what they carried. They could not have imagined a heated office building or glass cages or a scientist in the middle of the night staring at a glowing screen on their behalf. And yet, here we are, still quietly following the trail they left behind completely by accident. And notice what this story is not. It is not really a story about hair or sweat glands or teeth not deep down. It is a story about how staggeringly small the difference can be between two groups of human beings who look on the surface worlds apart. One letter, out of more than 3 billion. That is the entire gap between having this particular trait and not having it. Everything else about us, the instinct to comfort a crying child, the ache of missing someone, the small, stubborn hope that things might feel a little easier up ahead, none of that cares one bit which version of that letter you happen to carry. Because here is the thing worth sitting with as your eyes start to grow heavy tonight. Every single trait we are going to wander through together across this journey, every strand of hair, every eye colour, every quirk tucked into skin or bone, all of it comes from stories exactly like this one. Small, ancient, almost invisible changes spreading quietly across thousands of years, shaping the outside of us, while the inside, the part that laughs and worries and loves, stayed remarkably comfortingly the same. But hair and teeth are only the beginning of what that ancient winter of discovery eventually uncovered. Because it turns out there is another secret hiding in the human body tucked away somewhere far stranger and far smaller than a strand of hair. It is sitting quietly right now in a place you would probably never think to look, somewhere just behind your own ear. Now, I promised you a secret hiding somewhere behind your own ear, and I meant that quite literally, because for a strange stretch of the 20th century, one of the most overlooked corners of human biology sat exactly there, waiting patiently for anyone curious enough to go looking. I know how that sounds. Earwax is not exactly the stuff of grand historical drama. It does not sound like it belongs anywhere near a story about ancient migrations or the shaping of entire populations. And if someone had told me years ago that I would spend an evening talking about it with genuine excitement, I probably would have laughed them out of the room. But stick with me here, because this particular thread of biology turns out to reach much further than anyone expected. And it starts with something families had quietly noticed for generations without ever having a proper explanation for it. Long before anyone understood why doctors and curious parents across Japan had noticed that earwax seemed to come in two distinct flavors, and it ran in families with almost mathematical precision. Some households produced the kind most people picture sticky, amber-colored, faintly damp. Other households, generation after generation, produced something else entirely dry pale, almost flaking away like fine dust. Grandmothers noticed it. Aunts compared notes at family gatherings without ever quite putting a name to what they were noticing. In 1962, a researcher named A. Matsunaga finally sat down and studied this pattern carefully across Japanese families and confirmed something remarkable. This was not random, and it was not some old wives' tale passed around at the dinner table. It behaved exactly like a simple inherited trait, following the same tidy rules a school teacher might use to explain eye colour: one version dominant, one version quietly recessive, passed down the family tree like a stubborn heirloom nobody actually asked for. For decades after that, scientists knew the pattern existed, confirmed and tidy on paper, yet they had no idea where inside the vast human genome the responsible gene actually resided. Searching for one specific gene among more than 20,000 of them is a little like being handed a single misprinted word somewhere inside an entire library and told to go find it shelf by shelf without so much as a call number to start from. Then, in 2002, a research team led by Koichiro Tomita took on that exact kind of painstaking detective work. Working with 8 Japanese families across several generations, comparing which relatives had which earwax type against which stretches of deoxyribonucleic acid they happened to share, the team slowly narrowed the search down to a specific neighborhood, a stretch of chromosome 16 somewhere near its center. Nearly there, but not quite near enough to name a single culprit. The final answer arrived in 2006 through the work of Koichiro Yoshiura and his colleagues at Nagasaki University. Combing through that narrowed region of chromosome 16 letter by letter, they found it a gene called ABCC11, and inside it one single precise typo. Scientists have a fairly dry technical term for a difference this small: a single letter swap at one exact spot in the genetic code shared by an entire species. They call it polymorphism, which is really just a fancy way of saying that at this one address, different people carry different letters, and both versions are common enough to be considered entirely normal. At a specific spot in the genetic sequence, some people carry the letter G, others carry the letter A instead. That is the entire difference. One chemical letter swapped for another at one particular address inside one particular gene, out of more than 3 billion addresses in total. Here is where it gets worth your attention, because that gene does something quietly clever for a living. It belongs to a whole family of genes whose job is essentially the same everywhere in the bodybuilding tiny protein pumps embedded in the walls of cells, constantly ferrying molecules from the inside out. This particular member of the family sits inside certain glands, scattered across the body, and helps push fat and protein-rich molecules out of the cell, almost like a miniature delivery truck constantly hauling cargo out to the curb. in people carrying the ordinary version of the letter that truck runs at full capacity. The glands secrete plenty of cargo and earwax comes out wet and sticky as a result. But that one-letter typo swaps out a single building block in the protein itself, replacing it at position 180, and the truck essentially breaks down. Less cargo gets hauled out. The earwax that forms is drier, flakier, and noticeably paler. Now, earwax alone would already make for a decent piece of trivia to pull out at a dinner party. But the story does not stop at the ear canal, and this is the part that still catches people off guard the first time they hear it. The very same type of gland responsible for earwax also sits tucked away in your armpits. And that same gene, the same tiny broken down delivery truck, controls how much odor-producing material those glands push out as well. People carrying the fully working version of the gene tend to produce noticeably more of the compounds that bacteria on the skin break down into what we recognize as body odor. People carrying the non-working version tend to produce far less, sometimes so little that body odor is barely noticeable at all, even without much effort. One single letter in one single gene quietly deciding two things about a person that most of us assume have nothing to do with each other whatsoever. And there is a third thread tucked into that same gene one that surprised researchers when they first stumbled across it. That same family of glands, it turns out, shares deep evolutionary roots with the glands inside a mother's breast, responsible for early milk production. A study published years after Yoshiora's original discovery found that women carrying the wet working version of the gene tend to produce colostrum, that thick, nutrient-dense first milk, more readily than women carrying the dry version. Nobody set out looking for a connection between earwax and early motherhood. It simply turned out to already be sitting there woven into the same strand of deoxyribonucleic acid the whole time, waiting to be noticed. Think about that for a moment, because it tends to surprise most people the first time they hear it laid out plainly. Most traits we carry are built by dozens, sometimes hundreds of different genes, working together in some complicated committee, each one nudging the outcome a little this way or that. Height works that way. Eye color mostly works that way. But this one does not. Researchers studying ABCC11 have pointed to it as possibly the single clearest example in the entire human genome of one solitary genetic letter, controlling something you can notice immediately, with nothing more sophisticated than your own senses. No laboratory required, just your nose or a cotton swab and a bit of curiosity. And the distribution of that letter across the globe follows a pattern that should sound familiar by now. In Korea, the dry low odor version sits nearly universal, carried by almost everyone. Across Japan and mainland China, the number settles around 90%. Move outward towards Southeast Asia, the Pacific Islands, Central Asia, and the indigenous populations of the Americas, and the frequency drops into a wide middle ground, often somewhere between 30 and 50%, a kind of fading echo of an ancient migration route, heading further and further from wherever this all first began, growing weaker with every generation and every mile. And in Europe and across much of Africa, the picture flips entirely. The dry low odor version becomes rare almost to the point of vanishing, showing up in only a small handful of people out of every 100. So rare that most people of European ancestry could go through an entire lifetime without ever once meeting anyone with dry earwax at all. If that geographic pattern sounds oddly familiar, you have got a good memory. It is not the first time tonight a single genetic letter has drawn nearly the exact same line across a map splitting the world into one side that carries a change and one side that mostly does not. Biology, it turns out, keeps drawing versions of the very same border over and over again, just with a different trait doing the tracing each time. That gradient is not a coincidence, and it is not a cultural habit passed down through generations of family customs either. It is a genetic signature stretched thin across thousands of miles and tens of thousands of years, tracing the outward ripple of ancient population movement as faithfully as a ring inside a tree trunk. Every person alive today is in a very real sense still standing somewhere along that ripple, whether they have ever thought about it or not. There is a wonderfully human twist to this story too, one that plays out in doctors' offices across Japan even today. There is a recognized medical condition called axillary osmidrosis, a formal name for unusually strong underarm odor caused by overactive glands, and it happens to correlate almost perfectly with the working wet type version of this gene. Before the genetics were understood, a physician evaluating a patient worried about the condition had to rely mostly on a physical exam and a careful conversation about family history, sometimes an uncomfortable conversation for a worried teenager or young adult to sit through, trying to describe something so personal to a stranger in a white coat. Today, a simple genetic test aimed squarely at this one gene can offer a much clearer, far more clinical answer, occasionally even helping guide a person's decision about whether surgery is worth pursuing at all. It is a strange kind of full circle, watching an ancient evolutionary quirk quietly show up centuries later as a practical, deeply personal question in a modern clinic waiting room. Have you ever actually stopped to think about which version of this you might be carrying? Most people never do. Honestly, not until a home genetic testing kit hands them a little chart they were not expecting, or until a conversation like this one nudges them to wonder for the first time sitting quietly in the dark with a hand reaching up toward their own ear without quite meaning to. If that is you right now, tell me about it down in the comments. And while you are there, let me know where in the world you're listening from tonight. I promise you are not the only one doing either. So where did all of this begin? Researchers tracing the age of this particular mutation have estimated it may have first appeared somewhere around 40,000 years ago, likely within an early founding population somewhere in ancient East Asia, long before agriculture, long before cities, long before anyone had a word for any of this. 40,000 years is a number almost too large to picture properly, so try this instead. It is roughly 4 times as old as the earliest cave paintings still surviving on the walls of caves in France and Spain. Whoever carried that first altered letter lived in a world without a single farm, a single permanent home, or a single written word anywhere on the planet. From there, this small mutation appears to have spread with unusual speed and strength, the kind of pattern that tells scientists natural selection was quietly at work favoring it. For some reason nobody has fully pinned down, and here is where I have to be honest with you, because a good storyteller does not pretend to know more than the evidence actually supports. Nobody has proven exactly why a drier gland and a fainter scent would have given someone a real advantage back then. Some researchers have wondered whether reduced body odor offered some protection against biting insects drawn to stronger scents, especially in cold climates, where thick clothing worn for months at a time might have trapped odor against the skin. Others suspect it may simply be tangled up with some other nearby trait that mattered more carried along for the ride rather than chosen for itself. It remains quite openly one of those loose threads in human history that science has not finished pulling on yet. I find something oddly comforting in that admission, if I am being fully honest with you. We like tidy answers. We like stories that wrap up into something clean and complete, every loose end accounted for, but real history rarely cooperates that way, and neither does real biology. Somewhere on a cold, half-remembered stretch of ancient Asia, a single person carried a broken protein pump they never knew existed, and that quiet accident followed their descendants across an entire continent, into languages, into families, into millions of ordinary mornings spent absent-mindedly cleaning out an ear canal, without the faintest idea what any of it meant. It is strange, is it not, how much of who we are gets decided by things this small, not a decision anyone made, not a lesson passed down around a fire, just a single letter quietly along for the ride through tens of thousands of years, showing up today in something as forgettable as a cotton swab, or as tender as a mother feeding her newborn for the very first time, But letters like that were not only reshaping skin and glands, somewhere else entirely buried inside a completely different gene. One particular letter was about to rewrite how an entire region of the world reacted to something people had been drinking together for thousands of years. Long before anyone understood the toast they were making came with a genetic asterisk attached. And this next one did not creep in quietly over tens of thousands of years the way the others did. This one arrived fast, tangled up with rice paddies fermentation and a decision an entire civilization made about what to plant in the mud. Picture southern China, somewhere along the marshy lowlands near a river valley, roughly 9,000 years ago. There is no writing yet anywhere on the planet, no wheel, no metal tools, just a small community of farmers ankle-deep in mud tending to a strange green grass they had only recently figured out how to coax into feeding an entire village. That grass was wild rice, slowly becoming something else entirely under human hands, and within a few centuries it would quietly set off a chain of events. Nobody in that village could have possibly predicted one that still shows up on your face today, if you happen to carry the wrong letter in exactly the right gene. In the 1990s, archaeologists digging at a site called Jiahu in what is now Henan province uncovered a set of ancient pottery jars that would eventually rewrite the timeline of one of humanity's oldest habits. The jars themselves were unremarkable to look at, cracked, half-buried, coated in a dull residue that most people passing through a museum storeroom would walk right past without a glance. A researcher named Patrick McGovern, working out of the University of Pennsylvania, later ran a careful chemical analysis on that crusted film, the kind of dried, stubborn build-up most people would scrub away without a second thought, before pouring in anything new. What he found, preserved there, locked into the clay for 9,000 years, was unmistakable, a fermented beverage made from rice honey and either hawthorn fruit or wild grapes. It remains one of the oldest pieces of solid evidence for alcoholic drink anywhere on the planet, older than the pyramids by thousands of years, older than the wheel brewed by people who would never see a single written word in their entire lifetime, and who almost certainly had no idea they were making history one clay jar at a time. I want you to sit with that image for a second, because it is easy to breeze past a detail like that without letting it land. Somewhere in a small farming settlement long before anyone had a name for chemistry, someone figured out, likely by accident at first, that leftover rice and fruit given enough time and warmth would turn into something that made people feel warm and loose and a little braver than usual. And once that discovery happened, it did not stay a private curiosity. It spread through the community, through neighbouring villages, and eventually across an entire region, becoming part of festivals, part of rituals, part of ordinary gatherings for thousands of years afterward. Here is the part almost nobody expects going in. All of that fermented rice drifting through so many generations of daily life appears to have left a permanent mark on human biology itself, not through culture or habit, but stitched directly into the genetic code carried by hundreds of millions of people alive today. To understand how you need a quick tour of what your body actually does with a sip of alcohol, and I promise this will not feel like sitting through a lecture. Think of it as a two-person cleanup crew working inside your liver, punching the clock the moment anything alcoholic enters your system. The first worker, an enzyme called alcohol dehydrogenase, grabs alcohol almost the moment it arrives and rapidly breaks it down into a compound called acetaldehyde. There is just one problem. Acetaldehyde happens to be considerably more toxic than the alcohol it came from, roughly the chemical equivalent of trading a mild headache for something your body treats as an actual threat. That is where the second worker steps in, an enzyme called aldehyde dehydrogenase, whose entire job is to grab that acetaldehyde immediately and convert it into harmless acetic acid, the same compound that gives ordinary vinegar its sharp bite before it has any real chance to cause trouble. In most people, that handoff between the two workers happens smoothly, quickly, almost invisibly. but in a very specific group of people, mostly concentrated in East Asia, one particular version of a gene called ALDH2 slows that second worker down dramatically sometimes to a near standstill. Acetaldehyde starts piling up with nowhere to go, and the body reacts about the way you would expect it, to react to a genuine toxin building up in the bloodstream. Blood vessels near the surface of the skin widen. The face and neck flush a deep, undeniable red, sometimes within minutes of the very first sip. The heart starts pounding faster than it should, almost as if the body has mistaken a glass of wine for a genuine emergency. Nausea and headache often follow shortly after. People today casually call it the Asian flush, or sometimes the Asian glow, usually said with a laugh at a dinner table or a wedding reception, though for a long time nobody actually understood what was happening inside the body to cause it. Here's a common misunderstanding worth clearing up while we're on the subject, because I hear it repeated constantly. A lot of people assume the flush means someone is getting drunk faster, or drinking more than everyone else at the table. That is not quite accurate. The flush reaction runs on an entirely separate biological track from actual intoxication. Someone can turn deep red after half a glass while remaining only mildly affected, and someone else can show no colour change at all while being considerably further along. The reddening is a toxin build-up showing up on the skin, not a scoreboard measuring how much alcohol has reached the brain. Two entirely different processes running side by side, easily mistaken for the same thing at a crowded party where nobody is paying particularly careful attention. It took until the early 1980s for medical researchers to properly connect the dots, publishing findings, identifying a deficiency in that specific liver enzyme as the real cause behind the reaction. So many families had simply learned to manage, joke about, or quietly work around by steering clear of alcohol altogether. Before that, it was just one of those unexplained personal quirks passed down and shrugged at, the kind of thing an aunt might mention at a holiday dinner without anyone thinking to ask why. Nobody had a proper vocabulary for it yet. It was simply understood in the way families understand things without ever writing them down, that certain relatives turned red after half a drink and certain others did not, and that was just how it had always been. There is actually a second gene tangled up in this same story too, one working from the opposite direction entirely. A variant of the first worker, the enzyme called ADH1B, runs unusually fast in some people, converting alcohol into acetaldehyde, far quicker than normal. Carry that fast version alongside a normal second enzyme, and acetaldehyde still ends up flooding the bloodstream faster than the body can clear it, producing much the same uncomfortable flush from a completely different mechanical direction. Some people carry one variant, some carry both. Either way, the result on a Friday night out tends to look remarkably similar. There is a strange little footnote worth mentioning here, one that always gets a reaction when I bring it up. Decades after doctors identified this natural quirk, pharmaceutical researchers developed a medication called disulfiram, sometimes sold under the name Antabuse, prescribed to people trying to overcome alcohol dependence. The drug works by deliberately blocking that same aldehyde dehydrogenase enzyme, the exact same one already running slow or broken in millions of people naturally. Take a sip while on the medication, and the same flushing, racing heart and nausea shows up almost immediately, engineered on purpose as a deterrent. In other words, for a meaningful share of the world's population, an ordinary evening out already comes with a version of a medical treatment other people have to be prescribed. Nobody designed it that way. Biology simply arrived there first, thousands of years ahead of the pharmacy. So where did any of this begin, and why does it concentrate so heavily in one part of the world? In the year 2010, a researcher named Bing Su, working at the Chinese Academy of Sciences, led a study tracing the age of that fast-acting ADH1B variant across 38 different populations, drawing on more than 2,000 individuals, Han Chinese, Tibetan, and a wide range of other ethnic groups scattered across the country. His team collected genetic samples, built out family trees stretching back generations, and used mutation rates the way a geologist reads layers of rock counting backward through accumulated genetic changes to estimate roughly when a given variant first appeared. His molecular dating pointed to somewhere between 10,000 and 7,000 years ago as the moment this particular version of the gene began spreading rapidly through the population. And when his team overlaid that timeline onto a map of ancient rice cultivation sites already uncovered by archaeologists across China, the two patterns lined up with startling precision, almost as if someone had traced one map directly on top of the other. Wherever early rice farming had taken root deepest and earliest, that genetic variant tended to sit at its highest frequency, today fading out gradually the further you travelled from those original farming heartlands. Now, why would a mutation that makes drinking alcohol distinctly unpleasant actually spread and stick around for thousands of years rather than quietly fade out? This is where I have to be honest with you, because the answer is not fully settled, and any storyteller who tells you otherwise is skipping past the interesting part. The leading hypothesis suggests something almost protective buried inside the discomfort itself. A community suddenly surrounded by newly abundant fermented rice, available in quantities nobody's ancestors had ever encountered before, faced a brand new risk. The risk of drinking too much too often, with consequences for judgment, health, and survival. A gene that made overindulgence deeply miserable, almost punishing on contact, may have offered real protection against exactly that danger nudging carriers toward moderation, whether they consciously chose it or not. There is something almost tender in that idea, honestly. A body quietly looking out for its owner across thousands of years, long before anyone understood what discipline or moderation even meant as concepts. Other researchers have raised a related idea suggesting a possible connection between this variant and reduced rates of certain liver diseases that were historically common across parts of East Asia, including infections that left unchecked over a lifetime can seriously damage the liver on their own. And a smaller number of scientists remain openly skeptical of the whole timeline, arguing the dating windows involved carry enough uncertainty that pinning the mutation's rise so precisely to rice farming alone might be reaching a little further than the evidence can fully support. Nobody has closed the book on this one yet, and honestly, that feels like the right place for the story to sit for now. Here is a number worth pausing on regardless of which hypothesis eventually wins out. Researchers estimate that somewhere around 540 million people alive today carry this particular version of ALDH2, the overwhelming majority of them tracing their ancestry to China, Japan, and Korea. In European and African populations, by contrast, the variant shows up so rarely, it barely registers on a map at all. Once again, without anyone planning it this way, an entire continent ended up on one side of a genetic line, and another continent ended up almost entirely on the other. I do want to leave you with one honest practical note before we move past this, because it matters, and a storyteller who cares about the people listening should not skip past it just to keep the mood light. Carrying this variant does not make alcohol safe if the flush reaction gets pushed through and ignored rather than respected, because acetaldehyde is legitimately toxic to human tissue. People who continue drinking, despite the discomfort, face a meaningfully higher risk of certain cancers over time, particularly cancer of the esophagus, a connection researchers have documented quite clearly across numerous studies now. It is not a minor statistical footnote either. The increase in risk is substantial enough that doctors across East Asia routinely bring it up with patients today. Your own body in this specific case is not exaggerating when it tells you to slow down. Have you ever watched someone turn bright red after a single glass of wine at a family dinner, or maybe felt your own face heat up before you even finished the toast? Tell me about it down in the comments, because I would honestly love to hear how many of you have lived with this without ever knowing the 9,000-year-old backstory sitting quietly behind it. It is a strange thought to sit with as the night gets quieter around you. A handful of ancient farmers standing ankle-deep in a rice paddy long before history had a name for itself made a small agricultural choice that rippled forward across hundreds of generations, eventually writing itself into the blood of more than 500 million people who would never once meet each other, never share a language, and never know the original village where it all began. They were not trying to shape the future. They were just trying to get through another season, feed another winter, keep another harvest from failing. And yet here we are all these thousands of years later, still carrying the consequences of their small, ordinary choices inside our own bodies, whether we ever raise a glass or not. But rice paddies and liver enzymes are not the only inheritance those ancient shifts in climate and geography left etched into us. Somewhere on the opposite end of the old world, in a much colder, much quieter corner of Europe, a single accidental change was about to hand an entire population something far more visible than a flushed cheek, something you can look someone straight in the face and see instantly without a single test required. There is a particular kind of moment in science where an assumption people have quietly carried around for centuries simply falls apart in the space of one afternoon, and the story of Blue Eyes happens to be exactly that kind of moment delivered by a Danish professor who spent more than a decade chasing down a single missing letter, working almost entirely out of public view until the very end. His name was Hans Eyberg, working out of the University of Copenhagen, and his search actually began back in 1996, long before anyone suspected quite how far the answer would eventually reach. Eyberg had turned his attention to a gene called OCA2, already known to play a leading role in how much pigment the human body produces, and he suspected it held the key to something people had wondered about for generations without ever getting a proper answer. Why does eye colour vary at all? Why does one sibling end up with eyes the colour of warm coffee, while another raised in the exact same household ends up with eyes the colour of pale winter sky, as though two entirely different sets of instructions had somehow been handed out around the same dinner table? For years, Eyberg and his colleagues worked patiently through large Danish families, tracing which relatives shared which eye colours and comparing that against the genetic material those same relatives happen to share. It is slow, careful work, the kind that rarely makes headlines on its own, cross-referencing family trees the way a genealogist might, except every branch on this particular tree needed to be checked against actual strands of deoxyribonucleic acid, rather than old parish registers. The breakthrough finally arrived in 2008, and it came from an unexpected direction. The switch controlling Blue Eyes was not sitting inside OCA2 after all. It was tucked into a neighbouring gene, entirely one called HERS2, in a small stretch of deoxyribonucleic acid that does not actually build any protein of its own, sitting quietly beside the gene it controls like a thermostat mounted on a wall next to the furnace it regulates. Think of it less like a light bulb and more like a dimmer switch wired into a completely different room. That switch does not turn OCA2 off. It simply turns the dial down specifically inside the iris, reducing how much brown pigment gets produced there without touching pigment production anywhere else in the body, which is exactly why blue-eyed people still have perfectly normal hair and skin pigmentation, rather than the pale, uniform lack of colour seen in albinism. Turn that particular dial down just enough, and a pair of eyes that would otherwise have come out a deep ordinary brown ends up pale instead, somewhere between grey-green and the clearest blue you've ever seen reflected off a lake at dawn. Here's where the story turns from interesting biology into something closer to a genuine surprise. Eyberg did not stop with Danish families. He gathered blue-eyed individuals from Turkey and Jordan as well, populations separated from Denmark by well over 1,000 miles, and by cultures with essentially no shared history. If blue eyes had appeared independently arising from separate accidental mutations, scattered across different populations over time, you would expect the surrounding stretch of deoxyribonucleic acid around that dimmer switch to look at least a little different from person to person, carrying the small individual fingerprints any independent mutation naturally leaves behind. That is not remotely what he found. Every single blue-eyed person in his study, regardless of where their family had lived for generations, carried the identical surrounding sequence, the exact same haplotype and unbroken genetic block passed down whole and unaltered. There was only one explanation that fit the evidence. This was not several separate accidents. It was one single accident happening exactly once in exactly one person at some particular point in the past. That does not mean every pair of blue eyes looks identical, and it is worth pausing on why. Core switch Iberg found determines whether the dial gets turned down at all, but a whole supporting cast of smaller genetic variants working quietly in the background decides exactly how far down that dial ends up sitting for any individual person. That is why one person's eyes settle into a pale, almost translucent grey, while another's land somewhere closer to a deep saturated turquoise, and another still ends up somewhere in between, shifting slightly, depending on the light in the room or the colour of the shirt they happen to be wearing that day. One shared ancestor started the story. Countless smaller, quieter genetic details have been writing the individual variations ever since. Sit with that for a moment, because it deserves more than a passing nod. Somewhere between roughly 6,000 and 10,000 years ago, likely somewhere near the region encircling the Black Sea, based on where the earliest and most concentrated traces of this pattern still cluster. Today, one single human being was born with a tiny genetic accident nobody around them could possibly have noticed at the time. And every person alive today with naturally blue eyes, whether they grew up in Stockholm, Chicago, or a small farming town in Kansas, is quietly carrying a fragment of that one individual's deoxyribonucleic acid, passed down unbroken across roughly 400 generations. If you happen to have blue eyes yourself, or you're sitting there picturing someone you love who does take a second and really let that settle, you're not just looking at a pretty collar. You're looking at a genetic thread that connects a stranger from thousands of years ago directly to the person across the table from you tonight. Go ahead and tell me down in the comments, do you have blue eyes, or does someone dear to your heart? And did you ever imagine that trait traced back this precisely? Worldwide, blue eyes remain remarkably rare, showing up in somewhere around 8 to 10% of the global population, and even that modest figure is almost entirely inherited from this one lineage, rather than scattered evenly across the map. Concentrate on northern and eastern Europe, specifically places like Estonia and Finland, and the numbers climb dramatically with the majority of the population carrying it. Travel south toward the Mediterranean, and the frequency drops off noticeably even within the same continent. It is a trait that spread outward in fading rings, from wherever that original ancestor once stood, growing thinner and thinner the further you travel from the centre. Now here is where I need to gently correct something a lot of people assume without ever questioning it, myself included, until the evidence eventually laid it out plainly. There is a common picture people carry in their heads of ancient northern Europe, something like a single evolutionary makeover. Pale skin and light eyes arriving together as one neat package, both showing up at once, as Europeans adapted wholesale to weaker sunlight further from the equator. Textbooks sometimes make it sound almost like a matching set, as though one adaptation naturally implied the other. It sounds tidy. It sounds like it should be true. It is not, and the proof came from an unlikely source, a set of bones that had been resting quietly in a cave for thousands of years, waiting for someone to finally come along and ask them the right question. In 2014, researchers working with the Spanish National Research Council, led by a scientist named Carles Lalueza Fox, alongside a genetics centre in Denmark, recovered and sequenced the complete genome of a Mesolithic hunter-gatherer, whose remains had been sitting undisturbed in a cave in Leon, Spain, discovered purely by chance back in 2006 by an archaeologist named Julio Manuel Vidal Encinas, who had not gone looking for anything of the sort that day. The remains, nicknamed La Braña, after the site where they were found, dated back roughly 7,000 years, placing this particular individual almost squarely in the same rough window as the blue-eyed founder mutation we just talked about. Cold stable temperatures deep inside that mountain cave had done something remarkable, preserving fragments of deoxyribonucleic acid intact for 7,000 years, patient and untouched, waiting for a team with the right tools to finally come looking. And when the genome finally came back, it told a story nobody on the research team was fully expecting. This ancient European hunter-gatherer carried the same genetic variant responsible for blue eyes, the very same one traced back to that single ancestor near the Black Sea. But his skin pigmentation genes were an entirely different story, closely resembling patterns typically associated with African populations, rather than the pale skin most people today automatically picture when they imagine an ancient European. In plain terms, here was a man walking through the forests of Iberia 7,000 years ago, with strikingly pale ice-coloured eyes, set into a noticeably dark complexion, a combination that essentially no longer exists naturally anywhere on the continent today. The head researcher on the study admitted afterward that the result took the whole team by surprise, describing it as an unusual phenotype tucked inside a genome that otherwise seemed in almost every other respect like a fairly ordinary Northern European. That single skeleton quietly dismantled a tidy assumption an entire field had been leaning on for years. Blue eyes and pale skin were never one evolutionary story wearing two different costumes. They are two completely separate genetic events arising from entirely different mutations moving through European populations along entirely different timelines, and simply happening to overlap geographically by the time we reach today. Nature, it turns out, rarely hands out tidy packages. It hands out scattered, unrelated accidents that only look coordinated in hindsight, once enough of them happen to pile up in the same region over enough centuries. It is worth pausing on the other side of this story too, the side that almost never gets mentioned in the same breath. Across East Asia, this particular founder mutation essentially never took hold at all. Brown eyes remain nearly universal there today, not because anything was lost or left behind, but simply because the specific accident that produced blue eyes happened once, in one person, in one place, roughly a continent away from where East Asian populations were living out their own separate histories at the time. There was never a competing version waiting to spread eastward. The dice simply never landed that way on that side of the old world. It helps to remember too that brown eyes were never really a separate invention needing their own origin story in the first place. Brown is the ancestral condition, the setting every human being on the planet carried, before that one dimmer switch ever flickered going back, long before anyone had left Africa at all. Blue eyes are the unusual variation. Brown eyes are simply what happens when nothing unusual interrupts the original instructions. So in a strange sense, East Asian populations did not miss out on anything or fail to develop some special trait. They simply carried on with the same setting every single one of our ancestors already had, while one small isolated corner of the world happened to stumble onto something new. I find something quietly moving in all of this, if I'm honest with you. We tend to think of physical traits as sturdy, ancient, almost geological, as though pale eyes or dark skin must have arrived together locked in step, shaped by the same slow grinding pressure of wind and latitude and centuries. The truth turns out to be far more delicate than that and somehow far more human. A single, almost accidental flicker in one person's deoxyribonucleic acid, carried forward by pure chance through generation after generation, entirely disconnected from whatever else happened to be evolving in the skin just beneath it. Two separate stories written by two separate accidents that only look like one story, because we are standing far enough away in time to blur the details together. It is a small, humbling reminder that most of what we assume about how bodies came to look the way they do is guesswork dressed up as certainty, right up until someone finally digs deep enough to check, There is something else worth sitting with too, something almost tender if you let it be. That single ancestor near the Black Sea never knew what they had started. They never saw a map, never understood genetics, and had absolutely no idea that a tiny dimmer switch flickering inside their own cells would end up connecting millions of strangers across thousands of years, all without a single one of them ever being introduced. Somewhere out there tonight, two people with the exact same shade of pale blue eyes might be standing in line together at a grocery store, complete strangers sharing a family tree neither of them will ever know about. But eyes were only the beginning of what the last ice age carved into European and Asian faces. There is another feature sitting right in the middle of the face and impossible to miss, that tells an even stranger story, one where two completely different continents ended up solving the exact same freezing problem in two entirely different ways, without either side ever knowing the other had come up with an answer at all. And unlike a gene tucked away inside a strand of deoxyribonucleic acid, this next one is something you have looked at on every single face you have ever met, without ever once stopping to wonder why it looks the way it does. Reach up, if you do not mind, and rest a finger lightly against the bridge of your own nose for just a second. Feel that. Most of us walk around for an entire lifetime without giving that particular piece of anatomy a single serious thought, beyond maybe wishing it looked slightly different in a photograph or complaining about it fogging up a pair of glasses on a cold morning. And yet it turns out to be one of the most quietly debated features in the whole story of how the old world split into different-looking populations, a debate that started with a British anatomist measuring skulls in a dusty museum storeroom more than a century ago, long before anyone had the faintest idea what deoxyribonucleic acid even was. His name was Arthur Thompson, and sometime in the 1800s, while working through collections of human skulls gathered from wildly different corners of the planet, catalogued and cross-referenced in the quiet, dusty way 19th century science tended to operate, he noticed something that seemed almost too simple to matter at first. Populations from cold, dry regions of the world tended to have long, narrow noses. Populations from hot, humid regions tended to have shorter, wider ones. It was the kind of observation easy to dismiss as coincidence, the sort of pattern a less careful researcher might have scribbled in a margin and forgotten about entirely. Thompson did not let it go. He wrote the pattern down formally. Other researchers over the following decades kept noticing the exact same trend in their own skull collections, scattered across different museums and universities, and eventually the observation earned itself an informal name inside academic circles, quietly known ever since as Thompson's nose rule. For more than 100 years, that is largely where the story sat, an interesting pattern, documented in bone without anyone quite proving whether climate had actually shaped it on purpose, or whether it was simply an old coincidence nobody had gotten around to testing properly. Skulls, after all, cannot tell you much about airflow or moisture, or the actual living tissue draped across them while a person was still breathing. That finally changed in 2017 when two researchers at Penn State, Arslan Zaidi and Mark Shriver, decided to test the old rule the modern way using living volunteers rather than skeletal remains pulled from a museum drawer. They gathered a large group of participants tracing their ancestry to West Africa, East Asia, South Asia, and Northern Europe, then used detailed three-dimensional facial imaging to measure every meaningful dimension of the nose with genuine precision: nostril width, the distance between nostrils, overall nose height, how far the tip projected outward, and the total surface area involved in each breath drawn in. Rather than simply eyeballing similarities the way researchers a century earlier had been forced to, the team ran statistical comparisons designed specifically to distinguish a trait truly shaped by climate from one that had simply drifted into its current shape through pure random chance generation after generation, with no particular pressure pushing it in any direction at all. What they found lined up with Thompson's century-old hunch, almost perfectly. though now backed by hard numbers instead of a trained eye scanning bone. Nostril width and the width of the nose's base showed a clear, statistically strong relationship with the climate a person's ancestors had lived in for generations. Wider nostrils turned up consistently in populations whose ancestry traced back to warm, humid regions. Narrower nostrils turned up consistently in populations whose ancestry traced back to cold, dry ones. Participants with West African ancestry showed the widest measurements in the group. Those with Northern European ancestry showed the narrowest. And critically, the researchers were able to show this differentiation across populations was too pronounced to be explained away by simple, random genetic drift alone, the kind of unremarkable, purposeless variation you would expect if climate had nothing to do with it. Something had been actively shaping this feature over generations, and Thompson had apparently stumbled onto the right idea more than 100 years before anyone had the tools to properly check his work. The South Asian participants in the study made for an especially interesting middle case, and it is worth pausing on them for a moment rather than skipping straight past. Measurements there landed somewhere between the two extremes, neither as wide as the West African group, nor as narrow as the Northern European one, which lines up neatly with the region's own varied climate history, stretching from humid coastal lowlands to considerably drier, cooler areas further inland and at higher elevation. Even within a single broadly defined population, the nose still seemed to be quietly tracking the specific climate its ancestors had actually lived through, rather than following some simple single rule tied to a whole continent. This research has ended up mattering well beyond academic curiosity too. Surgeons performing reconstructive procedures, engineers designing medical breathing equipment meant to fit a wide range of faces comfortably, and researchers studying respiratory illness across different populations have all leaned on exactly this kind of data, because a mask or a splint or a surgical technique built around the assumption of one universal nasal shape tends to fit plenty of people poorly. Something as ordinary as needing a properly fitted breathing mask during a hospital stay traces its design considerations, whether the patient realizes it or not, straight back to the same ancient climate pressures we have been discussing tonight. The mechanism behind it, once you hear it explained, feels almost obvious in hindsight. Every breath you take has to pass across the moist, richly vascularized lining inside your nasal passage before it ever reaches your lungs, and that passage does real essential work along the way, warming cold air and adding moisture to dry air, so your delicate lung tissue never has to deal with anything harsh or unconditioned. A narrower nasal passage forces incoming air to linger a little longer against that warm, wet lining, giving the body extra opportunity to adjust the air's temperature and moisture before it goes any deeper. In a cold, dry climate, where every inhaled breath arrives sharp and biting, that extra processing time becomes a real physiological advantage generation after generation, breath after breath for thousands of years running. In a warm, humid climate, the incoming air barely needs adjusting at all, so a wider, more open passage works perfectly well without costing anything. Here is where the story earns its place alongside the ones we have already spent tonight exploring, because Northern Europe was not the only region on the planet dealing with brutally cold, dry air for tens of thousands of years. Ancestral populations across Siberia and Central Asia faced conditions every bit as harsh, sometimes considerably more so, through repeated ice ages that turned huge stretches of the region into something closer to a freezer than a livable landscape. And when those populations solved the exact same problem warming and moistening frigid air before it reached fragile lungs, they largely reached for a different architectural answer entirely. Rather than relying primarily on a long, narrow, forward-projecting nose the way Northern Europeans did, populations adapted to the deep cold of ancient East Asia tended to develop a noticeably flatter facial profile overall, with wider, more prominent cheekbones and reduced outward nasal projection. On the surface, that might sound like the opposite strategy, a face built with less of a nose rather than more of one. but researchers studying the internal architecture rather than just the visible exterior have found something quietly elegant hiding underneath. Physical anthropologists going back to a researcher named Weiner in the 1950s, and confirmed by several more recent studies measuring skull and facial structure across cold-adapted populations, have documented that the internal nasal cavity in these populations tends to run taller and narrower than the external shape alone would suggest, tucked back behind that broader, flatter face rather than projecting outward in front of it. The underlying physics stayed identical, more contact time between incoming air and warm moist tissue, but the engineering solution took a completely different external form to get there. Think about that for a moment, because I find it honestly one of the more elegant details in this whole story. Two populations separated by an entire continent, both facing the exact same brutal problem of surviving, repeated ice ages arrived at two visually distinct facial structures that were quietly solving the identical physics problem underneath the skin. Nobody compared notes. Nobody exchanged blueprints across thousands of miles of frozen steppe and tundra. Natural selection simply kept testing whatever slight variations happened to show up in each population generation after generation, and kept whichever version worked without any particular loyalty to a single correct-looking shape. It is convergent evolution, essentially the same solution rediscovered independently, and it happened right there on two different human faces at once. If you ever needed a small, quiet example of how nature does not care about elegance for its own sake, only about what keeps a person breathing comfortably through another freezing winter, this is about as clean an example as biology has ever handed us. Have you ever noticed the shape of your own nose and wondered exactly where it came from? Take a look in a mirror sometime this week, or better yet, look at photographs of your parents and grandparents side by side and see how much of that particular architecture has been quietly passed down the family line, without anyone ever discussing it out loud. The same bridge, the same tip, the same subtle curve reappearing generation after generation, like a signature nobody remembers signing. Tell me down in the comments what part of the world your own nose seems to be arguing for. Now, before we move on, I want to be honest about a wrinkle in this story, because a good storyteller does not smooth over the parts that resist fitting neatly. And this particular wrinkle is a truly strange one. If cold, dry climates reliably produce narrower noses, you would expect Neanderthals who survived across an icy Europe for hundreds of thousands of years to have developed the narrowest noses of anyone. Instead, the fossil evidence shows the exact opposite. Neanderthal noses were unusually wider than you would predict from the climate alone, and for decades that contradiction honestly puzzled researchers working in this field. The leading explanation researchers have settled on involves something almost entirely unrelated to breathing at all. Neanderthals inherited unusually large front teeth and a broad palate from older ancestral populations further back on their family tree anatomy that had nothing to do with cold weather and everything to do with a much older evolutionary inheritance, likely useful for a diet that demanded heavy use of the front teeth for gripping and tearing. That oversized dental and jaw structure physically pulled the edges of the nasal opening wider as the face developed regardless of what the climate actually called for. In other words, an older evolutionary constraint essentially overpowered whatever cold climate pressure was pushing in the opposite direction. Leaving Neanderthals with a nose-shaped climate alone would never have predicted on its own a genuine tug-of-war between two competing evolutionary demands, with the older one winning out. I actually love that detail, if I'm honest with you, because it is such a useful reminder that evolution is rarely one single clean rule playing out in isolation. It is usually several competing pressures wrestling with each other at once, sometimes for hundreds of thousands of years, and the shape you end up looking at in the mirror is whatever compromise happened to win that particular argument. Climate pulls in one direction, inherited anatomy pulls in another. Sometimes climate wins cleanly the way it mostly did across northern Europe and East Asia. Sometimes something much older gets the final say, instead the way it apparently did for an entire vanished branch of the human family tree. There is something oddly comforting in that idea too, at least to me. Your own face is not simply a straightforward climate report written on skin and cartilage. It carries multiple stories layered on top of each other, some recent, some unbelievably old, some still faintly visible if you know exactly where to look, and some buried too deep in the family tree to ever fully untangle. Every single person watching this right now is walking around with a small, quiet museum built directly into their own face, and almost nobody ever stops to examine the exhibits running errands and living ordinary lives with tens of thousands of years of trial and error quietly folded into the geometry of their own skull. But noses were only ever half the conversation happening on that same stretch of cold ancient landscape. There is another feature sitting just above it, tucked right into the eyes themselves, that carries an even stranger story one scientists still have not fully agreed on after decades of careful looking, and it involves a debate that reaches back across two entirely different continents at once, with evidence that occasionally seems to contradict itself depending on which population you happen to be looking at. The feature in question sits at the inner corner of the eye, a small fold of skin draping down from the upper eyelid toward the bridge of the nose, and it goes by the somewhat clinical name epicanthic fold. It shows up with real consistency across East Asian populations found in roughly half the population, or more depending on which group you look at, and it turns out to be one of those traits scientists have spent decades circling, without ever quite landing on a single satisfying answer. I actually appreciate that about this next story. Not every mystery tonight gets tied off neatly with a clean finish. This one stays a little open-ended, and I think that honesty is worth more than a tidy answer invented just to make the segment feel complete. Before we get into the competing theories, I want to clear up something that trips up almost everyone, including plenty of cosmetic surgeons early in their training, because it certainly tripped me up the first time I dug into the anatomy properly. Most people casually lump two completely different eyelid features together under one loose mental category: the fold of skin at the inner corner of the eye, and the smooth, crease-free appearance of the eyelid itself, sometimes called a monolid. They often show up on the same face, so it makes sense that people assume they must be the same thing wearing two different names. They are not, and the confusion runs deep enough that even certain older medical textbooks blurred the line between them for years. Detailed anatomical studies, including a widely cited piece of research published in the journal Ophthalmology in 2009 by a researcher named Kakizaki, examined actual eyelid tissue removed during careful cadaver dissection, and found that these two features come from entirely separate anatomical mechanisms, controlled by entirely separate pieces of internal architecture. Whether an eyelid shows a visible crease depends on where a particular internal structure called the orbital septum joins up with the muscle responsible for lifting the eyelid, a connection point that sits noticeably lower in many Asian eyelids than in many European ones, sometimes by several millimeters, a small distance that ends up making a considerable visual difference. That lower connection point allows a small cushion of fat to settle further down toward the eyelid margin, producing a fuller, smoother, crease-free look. The epicanthic fold, meanwhile, is a completely separate piece of architecture involving how the skin and a band of underlying muscle fold and anchor themselves right at the inner corner of the eye. Two different features, two different sets of instructions frequently appearing together on the same face, purely by coincidence, or more accurately, because whatever forces shaped one of them tended to favour the other as well, without the two ever actually being one single trait pretending to be two. You can in fact have a visible crease and still carry the fold, or carry the fold without the crease at all, a combination surgeons see often enough that it barely raises an eyebrow anymore. Now onto the actual mystery the part scientists still argue about at conferences. The leading explanation, and the one you will hear most often if you go looking, is built around cold weather survival. The idea suggests that populations living through repeated ice ages across the harsh, wind-scoured plains of ancient Central and Northeast Asia developed extra fat padding around the eyes as genuine insulation protecting delicate eye tissue and the surrounding sinuses from brutal sustained cold in a landscape offering nowhere to hide from the wind for miles in any direction, sometimes for months at a stretch, without a single tree or hillside to break it. Layered onto that same idea sits a second related hypothesis: protection against snow blindness, the painful temporary vision loss caused by intense sunlight, bouncing endlessly off flat expanses of snow and ice. A slightly narrowed opening at the inner eye, the thinking goes, may have helped cut down on exactly that kind of harsh, reflected glare, the same practical instinct that eventually led Arctic hunters to carve narrow slits into bone and ivory goggles, thousands of years later, long after biology had already been quietly working on its own version of the same solution. It is a tidy story, and it certainly sounds plausible sitting here in a warm room tonight. There is just one stubborn problem with it, and it is the kind of problem a careful scientist cannot simply wave away, because the rest of the theory feels convincing. The epicanthic fold also shows up at meaningful frequency among the Khoisan peoples of southern Africa, one of the oldest continuously distinct population groups on the entire planet, according to genetic studies who have lived for many thousands of years in warm, sun-scorched desert and semi-desert terrain, about as far removed from an ice age as any environment on the planet. If this trait exists purely as a defense against freezing cold and reflected snow glare, its presence there makes very little logical sense. Nobody is fighting off snow blindness in the Kalahari. Researchers have offered a broader alternative to patch that hole, suggesting the fold might not be specifically about cold or snow at all, but about something more general: protection from intense ultraviolet exposure in any environment where sunlight reflects aggressively off a pale open landscape, whether that landscape happens to be snow-covered steppe or sun-bleached desert sand. Both settings share one thing in common: after all, brutal glare with very little shade to escape into. That version of the theory fits the Southern African evidence more comfortably, but it still leaves a fair number of open questions researchers have not managed to settle completely, including why certain other populations living through equally harsh, glare-heavy environments never developed anything resembling this particular fold at all. I think it is worth pausing here for something a little more sober too, because this particular feature carries a heavier history than most of the traits we have covered tonight. For much of the 19th and early 20th centuries, unqualified observers with far more confidence than actual evidence took a single visible trait like this one and turned it into a lazy shorthand for entire sweeping categories of people, stacking crude physical labels on top of populations, as though a fold of skin could summarize a person's intelligence, character, or worth. None of that ever held up under honest scientific scrutiny, and modern researchers studying eyelid anatomy today treat it exactly the way it deserves to be treated, as one small interesting piece of human variation among thousands of others worth understanding for its own sake and nothing more. The trait itself is fascinating. The old attempts to weaponize it into something bigger were simply bad science dressed up in unearned authority. Have you ever actually looked closely at the shape of your own eyes or a family member's and wondered which side of this whole debate your own ancestors might have been standing on: the cold plains, the sun-bleached desert, or perhaps somewhere else on the map entirely? I would love to hear it in the comments, especially if your family tree happens to stretch across more than one continent, because those stories tend to be the most interesting ones people share with me. The small physical details nobody in the family ever quite got around to explaining. It is worth mentioning too that this trait does not spread evenly, even within East Asia itself, showing up at noticeably different rates across different populations and even different regions within the same country. Another small reminder that we're never really talking about one uniform group sharing one uniform genetic story. Populations closer to the historically colder interior of the continent tend to show it more consistently, than some populations along the warmer, more humid coastline, a pattern that lines up reasonably well with the climate hypothesis, even if it cannot fully settle the argument on its own. There is a modern footnote worth acknowledging here too, purely as an observation rather than a judgment of any kind. Cosmetic procedures designed to add a visible crease to the eyelid, sometimes altering the epicanthic fold in the process, have become quite common across parts of East Asia in recent decades. I mention it only because it is a strange, very human twist on tonight's whole theme, an ancient trait shaped slowly over thousands of years by wind and glare and cold, now occasionally reshaped again in a single afternoon by a surgeon with a steady hand and a set of surgical tools that would have seemed like pure magic to anyone living through the Ice Age that likely started this whole story in the first place. Here is where I have to be fully honest with you the way I try to be every time one of these stories reaches its limits. Unlike several of the traits we've already spent tonight tracing back to one clean, identifiable genetic switch, a single letter here, one broken protein pump there. The epicanthic fold has resisted that kind of tidy genetic story so far. It appears to involve a whole cluster of genes working together during early facial development, rather than one dramatic, easily isolated mutation. Researchers can point to with confidence, which makes it considerably harder to study and considerably harder to date with any real precision the way we managed with hair texture, eye colour, or the alcohol flush earlier tonight. There is one interesting if incomplete thread worth mentioning though. Some researchers studying facial development have noted that the very same gene responsible for East Asian hair texture and sweat gland density, the one behind that dramatic genetic sweep we spent time with earlier tonight, appears to influence fat distribution across the face as well, potentially playing some partial role in this story too. Nobody's claiming it explains the whole picture, and I want to be careful not to overstate a connection that remains honestly tentative in the research. It may simply be one thread among several tangled up with other genetic factors nobody has fully mapped out yet a supporting actor, rather than the star of the show. I find something almost refreshing in a mystery that has not been solved yet, if I am honest with you, especially after an evening spent walking through so many stories that did eventually reach a clean, satisfying answer. Science does not actually owe us tidy endings on any particular timeline. Sometimes the honest answer is simply that researchers are still working on it, still gathering evidence, still arguing politely at conferences over coffee about which explanation fits the data best. That is not a failure of the story. It is what real ongoing science actually looks like most of the time, long before anything gets simplified down into a clean paragraph in a textbook. The tidy answers you hear elsewhere tonight took decades of exactly this kind of messy, unresolved argument before they ever became tidy at all. There is something worth sitting with in that thought as the night gets quieter around you. We like to imagine science as a finished library, every shelf stocked every question already answered by someone smarter than us decades ago. It is not that at all. It is closer to a house perpetually under renovation, some rooms fully built and furnished, other doors still standing half open, with tools left out on the floor, waiting for whoever walks in next with a fresh set of questions. The eyes looking back at you from every mirror you will ever stand in front of are one of those half-finished rooms entirely real, entirely yours, and not yet fully explained by anyone. Maybe that is exactly as it should be. A little mystery left over, even in something as ordinary as the shape of your own face, keeps curiosity alive in a way tidy answers rarely manage on their own. But not every ancient inheritance written into a face is this difficult to trace. Some stories left a trail so strange, so counterintuitive, that when scientists finally followed it all the way to the end, it led somewhere almost nobody expected. Straight back to a set of ancient relatives most people assume only ever mattered to Europe. And this next thread does not sit on the surface of the skin, at all tucked into fat or muscle or the angle of a bone. It is hiding much deeper than that, written directly into the blood of hundreds of millions of people who have never once thought to ask where it actually came from. In the year 2010, a team led by a researcher named Svante Pääbo, working out of the Max Planck Institute in Germany, finally finished something scientists had been chasing for decades: a full draft sequence of the Neanderthal genome, painstakingly pieced together from fragments of ancient bone recovered from caves scattered across Europe, each fragment handled with the kind of obsessive care usually reserved for something far more fragile than old, brittle, skeletal material. And buried inside that sequence sat an answer to a question that had quietly divided anthropologists for generations, argued over in academic journals and university lecture halls for longer than most of the researchers involved had even been alive. Did our species ever actually interbreed with Neanderthals? Or did modern humans and Neanderthals simply cross paths across the same landscape for thousands of years without ever really mixing at all? The genomes settle the argument almost immediately. Comparing that ancient sequence against the genomes of living people around the world, Pääbo's team found something unmistakable. Nearly everyone alive today whose ancestry traces outside of Africa carries a small but real trace of Neanderthal deoxyribonucleic acid, typically somewhere around 1 to 2% of their entire genome. Not a rumour. Not a folk tale passed down through generations of speculation. An actual measurable inheritance sitting quietly inside the cells of billions of people who have spent their entire lives with absolutely no idea it was there, tucked into the same strands of deoxyribonucleic acid that also determine far more mundane things like eye colour or a tendency to catch a cold easily in the winter. The timing and location behind that inheritance seemed reasonably settled too, at least at first. Researchers concluded the interbreeding most likely happened somewhere in the Middle East, sometime between roughly 50 and 80,000 years ago, when early modern humans first pushed out of Africa and ran directly into Neanderthal populations already living across that region, two closely related but distinct kinds of humans sharing the same rivers, the same hunting grounds, and apparently on occasion the same families. Crucially, this encounter appears to have happened before the ancestors of modern Europeans and modern East Asians had even split apart from one another into separate populations. Everybody heading out of Africa at that point was still, in a very real sense, one shared group walking the same general route, before eventually branching off toward very different corners of the Old World, one heading northwest into the cold forests of Europe, another continuing east across vast stretches of steppe and mountain toward what would eventually become China, Japan, and Korea. And that detail is exactly what makes the next discovery feel so strange. If every non-African population inherited its Neanderthal ancestry from that same single shared encounter, before anyone had actually split off toward Europe or Asia separately, you would reasonably expect the amount of Neanderthal ancestry to land at roughly the same level everywhere. One shared starting point should produce one shared result spread evenly across the branches that grew out from it afterward. That is not remotely what the data actually shows. When researchers went back and carefully measured Neanderthal ancestry across different modern populations, East Asian genomes consistently came back, carrying meaningfully more Neanderthal deoxyribonucleic acid than European genomes did. Estimates from different research teams have landed in slightly different places depending on the exact statistical method used, but the gap generally falls somewhere between roughly 10 and 20% higher in East Asian populations compared to European ones, and by some measurements the difference climbs even further than that. Sit with how strange that actually is for a second, because it deserves a proper pause rather than a passing mention. Every single Neanderthal fossil ever recovered, every bone, every tooth, every ancient hearth surrounded by stone tools has been found across Europe and parts of Western Asia. Not one has ever turned up in China, Japan, Korea, or anywhere across the rest of East Asia. Neanderthals, as far as the fossil evidence can tell us, never set foot there, and yet the population that supposedly never crossed paths with a single living Neanderthal ended up carrying more of their genetic inheritance than the population living in the exact region Neanderthals actually called home for hundreds of thousands of years. It honestly sounds like a contradiction, the kind of detail that should not be able to exist logically, and for a long stretch of time, researchers were not entirely sure what to make of it either. Have you ever taken one of those home genetic testing kits that hands you a small percentage next to the word Neanderthal, sitting there in a spreadsheet alongside your ancestry breakdown and your list of distant relatives, and wondered exactly how a number like that even gets calculated in the first place? Tell me down in the comments if you have seen your own number and whether it surprised you. The first serious explanation researchers put forward became known informally as the two-pulse hypothesis. Two separate research teams, one led by Benjamin Vanneau and Joshua Akey at the University of Washington, another working independently at the University of California in Los Angeles, under researchers Bernard Kim and Kirk Lohmieller, arrived at a similar conclusion around the same period, each approaching the genetic data from a slightly different statistical angle and landing on remarkably compatible answers. Their proposal suggested that the shared Middle Eastern encounter was not actually the whole story. A second, entirely separate round of interbreeding may have taken place later, specifically involving the ancestors of East Asian populations sometime after they had already branched away from the ancestors of Europeans, likely somewhere further east, along their migration route in a location, and at a moment nobody has pinned down with complete certainty just yet. It is an elegant explanation, and the statistics honestly support the idea that more than one mixing event took place. There is just one nagging complication attached to it, and I think it is worth sharing honestly rather than smoothing it over for the sake of a cleaner story. Fossil evidence currently suggests Neanderthals had already gone extinct in Europe by roughly 40,000 years ago. If that timeline holds up precisely as currently understood, it leaves a truly tight window, arguably an uncomfortably tight one for a second encounter, to have happened somewhere further east before Neanderthals disappeared from the planet entirely. Researchers working on this question are still refining exactly how those two timelines line up, and it remains one of the trickier details in an otherwise fairly compelling explanation. A newer explanation has picked up considerable support more recently, and it approaches the whole puzzle from a completely different angle. Rather than asking why East Asians ended up with more Neanderthal ancestry, this explanation flips the question around entirely and asks why Europeans ended up with less. A study published in 2023 drawing on ancient deoxyribonucleic acid recovered from human remains spanning roughly the past 40,000 years across Europe found something that reframes the entire mystery. Early European hunter-gatherers, the people living across the continent well before farming ever arrived, actually carried Neanderthal ancestry at levels reasonably near what shows up in East Asian populations today. The gap we now see was not there yet, at least not to the degree it exists now. Then, roughly 10,000 years ago, a large wave of early farmers began migrating into Europe from the Middle East, bringing agriculture, permanent settlements, and an entirely new way of life along with them, gradually spreading across the continent over the centuries that followed, and settling alongside communities of hunter-gatherers who had already been living there for tens of thousands of years. Crucially, these incoming farmers carried noticeably less Neanderthal ancestry themselves than the hunter-gatherers already living across Europe. As those two populations mixed together, intermarrying and blending over generation after generation, the farmers' comparatively lower Neanderthal ancestry gradually diluted the higher levels the original hunter-gatherers had been carrying, pulling the European average downward slowly and unevenly until it settled into the lower number we measure today. In East Asia, nothing quite like that particular demographic collision ever took place in the same way. No comparable wave of low Neanderthal ancestry farmers arrived to reshape the regional average the way it happened across Europe. The original level of Neanderthal ancestry carried by the earliest populations settling across that part of the world largely stayed put generation after generation, essentially undiluted, while Europe's own number was quietly, gradually watered down by a much later wave of migration nobody had originally factored into the equation. If that explanation holds up under further research, and increasing amounts of ancient deoxyribonucleic acid data do seem to be leaning in its favour, it means the entire mystery was framed backward from the very beginning. East Asians were never the population that mysteriously gained more Neanderthal ancestry from some unexplained second encounter. Europe was the population that lost some of what it originally had diluted by its own later history of migration, and mixing a history East Asia largely did not share in quite the same way. It is worth knowing too that this inherited fragment of Neanderthal deoxyribonucleic acid is not simply sitting there doing nothing. Researchers combing through modern genomes have connected specific Neanderthal-derived gene variants to a surprising range of everyday traits, including how efficiently certain immune systems respond to viral infections, how some people's skin and hair pigmentation gets regulated, and even in some studies patterns connected to mood and sleep. None of this means any single person's personality or health traces back cleanly to one ancient ancestor. It simply means the inheritance is functional, actively doing something inside modern bodies today rather than sitting there as some inert genetic fossil nobody's biology actually uses anymore. I find that reversal quietly satisfying, if I'm honest with you. The way a well-told mystery earns its ending by making you realize you had been asking the wrong question the entire time. We assume ancestry only ever accumulates in one direction, layer stacking neatly on top of layer as time moves forward. Real population history rarely works that tidily. Sometimes a population does not gain something new. Sometimes it simply loses a portion of what it already had, quietly, unevenly, and largely by accident, through nothing more dramatic than one group of farmers deciding to move west in search of better land. There is something worth reflecting on here beyond the raw genetics too. An entire vanished branch of the human family tree, extinct for tens of thousands of years, still shapes the genome of nearly every person watching this tonight, whose ancestry traces outside of Africa, whether their family history points towards Stockholm, Seoul, or somewhere in between. Neanderthals did not simply disappear when the last individual died out. Fragments of them are still here, quietly folded into modern immune systems, modern skin, and apparently modern population history, in ways researchers are still working out the full details of even now, tucked into genes involved in everything, from how efficiently a person's body fights off certain infections to how their skin responds to sunlight. No population alive today is some pure, untouched, unbroken line stretching back in isolation. Every single one of us is a patchwork stitched together from multiple ancient populations who met mixed, separated, and sometimes met again long before any of us existed to witness a single moment of it. It turns out the old tidy idea of separate, clean-edged human lineages was never quite accurate in the first place, and the deeper researchers dig, the messier, and honestly the more interesting that real family tree keeps turning out to be. History, it seems, was never particularly interested in keeping its branches neatly separated for our convenience. But blood was not the only thing shaped by ancient migration and mixing. Somewhere in a much more recent chapter of the same broader story, an entirely different kind of inheritance was quietly taking shape, this time built not around an extinct cousin species, but around something far more ordinary, a simple cup of milk, and what happened to the people who decided they could not go without it. And unlike Neanderthal ancestry buried tens of thousands of years in the past, this next chapter unfolds far more recently than you might expect, near enough to living memory that the story is still quite literally being written into the digestive systems of children being born today. For a long stretch of scientific history, this next story seemed almost too obvious to bother investigating properly. Europeans started keeping dairy cattle. Milk became a steady, reliable part of the diet. And naturally so, the thinking went anyone whose body could actually digest that milk into adulthood would have gained an enormous advantage over everyone else, and that advantage would have spread through the population almost immediately hand in hand with the cattle themselves. It made intuitive sense. It fit tidily into a single clean paragraph, the kind textbooks love and rarely bother questioning further. And as it turns out, it was mostly wrong in a way that took actual bones dug out of actual medieval graveyards to finally set straight decades after the tidy version of the story had already settled comfortably into common knowledge. Let me back up for a second and explain what is actually happening inside your body when you drink a glass of milk, because the biology here matters more than it might seem at first. An enzyme called lactase produced inside your small intestine is responsible for breaking down lactose, the particular sugar found in milk, into simpler sugars your body can actually absorb and use. Every single human infant produces plenty of lactase for the obvious reason that infant mammals depend entirely on milk to survive their earliest months of life. But across most mammal species, including humans, throughout most of our evolutionary history, that lactase production quietly shuts down after weaning, typically sometime in early childhood, once a growing body no longer needs to rely on a parent's milk for survival. There was never any particular reason for the body to keep manufacturing an enzyme meant for a food source a growing child was about to stop relying on anyway. Losing the ability to digest milk comfortably as an adult is not a defect or a malfunction. For the vast majority of human history, and for the vast majority of mammals alive today, including nearly every wild animal you have ever watched a documentary about, it is simply the normal expected outcome. Somewhere between roughly 10 and 8,000 years ago, that picture started to shift, at least for one segment of the growing human population. Communities across parts of Europe and the Middle East began domesticating cattle, sheep, and goats, and alongside meat and wool and leather, they gained a completely new food source, a steady, renewable supply of milk that did not require killing the animal at all. For a species that had only ever consumed milk as infants, this was something entirely new sitting on the table, or more accurately in the pail. Naturally, researchers assumed that whoever happened to carry any small genetic quirk allowing lactase production to continue into adulthood would have had an obvious edge: extra calories and nutrients available whenever the herd was healthy, and that edge should have spread through the population quickly once dairying became common. In 2004, a team led by a researcher named Todd Bersaglieri identified the specific genetic switch responsible for most of that ability across European populations: a single change in the deoxyribonucleic acid, sitting a considerable distance away from the lactase gene itself, roughly 14,000 letters upstream out in a stretch of the genome that does not build any protein on its own functioning, instead as a kind of permanent on-switch keeping lactase production running long after childhood ends. The genetic signature surrounding that mutation looked like one of the strongest, most recent examples of natural selection anywhere in the human genome, a pattern researchers typically associate with a trait spreading fast under real pressure in a comparatively short window of time, the kind of signal that tends to make a research team sit up a little straighter in their chairs. For a while the story seemed complete. Farming and dairying arrive. The mutation appears or already exists at low levels. Selection kicks in almost immediately. Everyone ends up drinking milk happily ever after. It is a clean narrative, and clean narratives are exactly the kind researchers should learn to be a little suspicious of, because reality rarely cooperates that neatly. The complication arrived once scientists started extracting actual deoxyribonucleic acid directly from the skeletons of early European farmers themselves, rather than only working backward from patterns in living populations, a considerably harder and more painstaking approach, but one that finally let researchers check the assumption against direct physical evidence instead of inference alone. Researchers examining these Neolithic remains, people who were already keeping dairy cattle, already living in settled farming communities, already presumably drinking at least some milk, found something that did not match the tidy assumption at all. Studies looking across skeletal samples spanning thousands of years and multiple regions of Europe kept turning up the same surprising result. The genetic switch for adult lactose production was almost entirely absent. These early dairy farmers, despite owning cows and presumably making use of their milk in some form, were overwhelmingly still lactose non-persistent as adults, just like every human population that came before them, and largely just like most of the rest of the world at the time. Have you ever stopped to think about how strange that actually is? An entire community surrounded by dairy cattle, going to the trouble of herding, feeding and milking those animals every single day, and the vast majority of the adults doing that work most likely could not comfortably drink a full glass of what they were producing. If you can drink milk today without a second thought, tell me down in the comments, because there is a decent chance you're only able to do that, thanks to a genetic switch your own farming ancestors did not actually have yet. So how did they manage the milk they were producing? The most likely answer involves processing it into forms that naturally contain far less lactose than fresh milk does cheese and fermented dairy products among them. Foods where the fermentation process itself breaks down much of the lactose before anyone ever takes a bite, courtesy of bacteria doing quiet chemical work long before anyone understood what bacteria even were. In other words, its early farmers were not necessarily drinking milk by the cupful the way modern imagination tends to picture them, ladling it straight from the pail, the way a modern advertisement might show it. They were almost certainly transforming it into something their own adult bodies could actually tolerate: technology, quietly working around a biological limitation nobody had a name for, yet solving a problem through cleverness in the kitchen, long before biology solved it through mutation in the bloodline. The real turning point came from a study examining deoxyribonucleic acid, pulled from a medieval cemetery in Dalheim, Germany, remains dating to around 800 years ago. Researchers there found the adult lactase persistence variant showing up in roughly 72% of the individuals tested, a number remarkably near the frequency seen across modern Germany and Austria today. Put those two data points side by side and a strikingly different timeline starts to emerge. The mutation existed at meaningfully low levels among the earliest farmers. It had reached something near its modern frequency by the medieval period, which means the real explosive spread of this trait happened largely across the years in between closer to the Bronze Age and onward, thousands of years after farming and dairying had already become an established part of European life, not alongside it the way the tidy version of the story always implied. Blue eyes and pale skin, we already found out earlier tonight, were never really one evolutionary package despite looking like one from a distance. It turns out dairying and the ability to actually digest dairy comfortably were never one package either. Two separate stories unfolding on two completely different timelines, only looking like a single coordinated adaptation because we are standing far enough away in history to blur the gap between them. Some researchers studying that Bronze Age surge have pointed toward a specific historical event that might help explain the timing large-scale migrations of herding populations moving westward out of the Pontic steppe, the vast grassland stretching north of the Black Sea into much of Europe, starting somewhere around 5,000 years ago. These migrating groups brought new ancestry, new languages, and quite possibly a meaningfully higher starting frequency of the lactase persistence mutation, along with them mixing into existing European populations and potentially giving the trait a substantial head start heading into the more intense selection pressure that followed. It remains an active area of research rather than a settled conclusion, but the timing lines up suggestively well with when the genetic signature really starts climbing. Why the delay, and why did the trait eventually spread so aggressively once it finally caught on, sweeping through parts of the population, fast enough that some researchers have estimated carriers of the mutation left meaningfully more surviving descendants per generation The non-carriers did a selection pressure strong enough to rank among the most powerful ever measured directly in the human genome. Researchers have proposed several reasonable explanations, and honestly, no single one of them has been proven definitively enough to settle the debate completely. Some point to simple caloric advantage extra nutrition available during lean years, when crops failed but a herd survived, potentially the difference between a hard winter and a fatal one for a struggling family. Others point toward calcium absorption, particularly valuable in northern regions where weaker sunlight already limited the body's ability to produce vitamin D through skin exposure, making an additional dietary source of calcium considerably more useful than it would be somewhere sunnier. A smaller number of researchers have raised the possibility that milk, when consumed fresh, rather than fermented, may have offered a safer source of hydration and nutrition in certain environments where water supplies carried a real risk of contamination, sidestepping a health hazard rather than chasing a nutritional bonus. None of these explanations cancel each other out completely, and it is entirely possible more than one pressure was pushing in the same direction at once, stacking advantages on top of each other rather than any single factor doing all the work alone. It is worth remembering too that this particular story belongs mostly to Europe. Across most of East Asia, this specific mutation never spread widely at all, and lactose intolerance in adulthood remains the far more common condition there today, not because anything went wrong, but simply because the specific genetic switch that took hold across parts of Europe never had the same opportunity to spread through populations relying far more heavily on rice, millet and other staple crops rather than dairy herding across most of their history. There was simply never the same sustained pressure pushing that particular mutation toward high frequency, because the herds that mattered so much on the steppes and pastures of Europe were never quite as central to daily survival across most of East Asia in the same way. Interestingly, this was never purely a European invention either. Certain pastoral communities across parts of Africa, particularly cattle herding groups in East Africa, developed their own completely separate genetic mutations, achieving the exact same result through an entirely different stretch of deoxyribonucleic acid, discovered decades after the European variant and confirming that evolution found more than one route toward the same practical outcome in more than one place at more than one point in history, each population arriving at a strikingly similar solution through its own independent trial and error. There is something almost humbling in how long this particular adaptation actually took once you know the real timeline rather than the tidy assumption. We like to imagine our ancestors adapting quickly and cleanly to whatever new resource showed up in front of them, herd the cattle gain, the mutation, solve the problem within a handful of generations. Real biology apparently needed thousands of years of patient, uneven trial and error, generation stacked on generation, long after the cows were already grazing in the field, before enough bodies finally caught up with what the pail had been offering all along. It is a quiet reminder that the gap between a good idea and a body actually adapted to use it can stretch across more centuries than any single family history could ever hope to remember. But milk was far from the only resource ancient climates and geography quietly reshaped inside the human body. Somewhere else in this same story, an entirely different kind of adaptation was unfolding, this time affecting something you cannot see, written into a single gene at all, but can see simply by looking at the shape and size of a person's entire frame standing across a room from you. An inheritance written not into one small switch, but into the overall architecture of an entire body. Picture two herders standing side by side for a moment, though they will never actually meet in real life, separated as they are by an entire continent and thousands of years of separate history. One tends reindeer across the frozen tundra of northern Scandinavia, part of the Sami people who have lived above the Arctic Circle for thousands of years, wrapped in thick layers against wind that can strip the warmth out of exposed skin within minutes. The other tends a very different herd across the equally frozen plains of Siberia, descended from populations who pushed deep into Northeast Asia during the same brutal ice ages, facing winters just as merciless, just as endless on the opposite side of the entire Eurasian landmass. Their faces would look strikingly different from each other. We already spent real time tonight explaining exactly why. But stand their bodies next to each other, wrapped in the same heavy layers of fur and wool, and something curious happens. The overall build, the proportions, the general architecture of the frame, carrying each of them through a bitter winter, would look remarkably, almost suspiciously similar. That is not a coincidence, and it is not some strange accident either. It is one of the oldest, most reliable patterns in all of biology, quietly reshaping bodies across the entire animal kingdom for longer than humans have existed to notice it. Back in 1847, a German biologist named Carl Bergmann noticed something while studying warm-blooded animals across different climates. Within a single species, populations living in colder regions consistently tended to be larger and heavier than populations of that same species living in warmer regions. The explanation comes down to simple, almost stubbornly logical physics. A larger body has proportionally less surface area relative to its overall volume, and since heat escapes through the surface of a body, rather than through its bulk, a bigger, bulkier frame loses warmth more slowly than a smaller one does. Picture two blocks of ice of different sizes left out in the same room. The smaller one always melts first, simply because it has more of its surface exposed relative to how much of it there actually is. A body works according to roughly the same stubborn arithmetic. In brutal cold that becomes a genuine survival advantage generation after generation, winter after winter. 3 decades later, in 1877, an American zoologist named Joel Asaph Allen noticed a closely related pattern, this time focused specifically on limbs and other extremities, rather than overall body bulk. Animals living in colder climates tended to have shorter arms, legs, ears, and tails relative to their torso, while animals from warmer climates tended to have noticeably longer ones. The logic runs along the exact same lines. Limbs and ears are mostly surface area, with comparatively little insulating bulk behind them, which makes them extremely efficient at radiating heat away from the body, the same reason a radiator is built with thin metal fins rather than one solid block of metal. In a hot climate, that is a genuine asset, an easy built-in cooling system. In a freezing one, it becomes a liability, a set of extremities constantly bleeding precious warmth out into the surrounding cold, which is exactly why frostbite tends to claim fingers, toes, ears, and noses first, the very parts of the body evolution has already been quietly trying to minimize in populations built for the cold. Put those two rules together, and you get a fairly clear blueprint for what a body built for extreme cold should look like: compact, stocky, broad through the trunk, with comparatively short arms and legs tucked in near the body, rather than stretched out and exposed. Researchers studying real human populations have found exactly that pattern showing up again and again wherever people settled into truly brutal cold for long enough stretches of time. A study conducted back in 1953 by a researcher named Marshall Newman looked specifically at populations across the far north, including Inuit and Aleut communities, and found body proportions lining up with Bergmann's prediction, with real consistency, heavier average body mass paired with a shorter limbs and broader trunk. Allen's rule would predict alongside it. More recent research has pushed the analysis even further, moving past simple observation into hard measurement. A study published in 2007 examining the actual bone structure of the hand and foot across 10 different populations spread around the globe found a genuine statistically measurable relationship between limb proportions and the minimum temperature a population's ancestors had historically endured, a relationship that held up even after researchers accounted for how nearly related different populations actually were to each other. This was not simply populations resembling their nearest relatives. Climate itself appeared to be doing real independent work on the shape of the human skeleton, with populations from historically colder regions consistently showing a shorter, stockier first bone in the hand and a wider, though not necessarily shorter, corresponding bone in the foot. Small measurements most people will never think twice about, yet precise enough to let a researcher make an educated guess about a skeleton's likely climate of origin without ever seeing the surrounding skin hair or a single scrap of clothing. Now here is where tonight's story takes an interesting turn, because we already spent time earlier walking through a very similar setup involving noses, and that story ended in genuine divergence. Two different populations solving the exact same cold weather problem, with two visibly different architectural solutions, one leaning on a long projecting bridge, the other on a broader, flatter face hiding a taller cavity underneath. Body shape tells almost the opposite story. Populations descended from the brutally cold reaches of ancient northern Europe, and populations descended from the equally brutal cold of ancient Northeast Asia did not diverge toward different body solutions the way faces sometimes did. They converged on essentially the same one: compact frames, shorter limbs relative to height, a stockier heat-conserving build showing up on both sides of an entire continent arrived at completely independently, without either population ever meeting the other or comparing notes across thousands of miles of frozen steppe and tundra separating them. It is a small, satisfying reminder that evolution does not follow one single rulebook consistently across every part of the body at once. Sometimes it splits into different answers, sometimes it lands on the very same one twice. Have you ever noticed how build sometimes seems to run in families or in entire regions almost more consistently than height alone would explain, showing up in the width of shoulders, the length of a forearm, the general silhouette a person casts standing in a doorway? I would love to hear where your own family's proportions seem to trace back to. Tell me down in the comments, because these small physical inheritances tend to carry more history in them than most people ever stop to consider. It helps to see the opposite end of the spectrum too, if only to make the whole pattern click into place properly. Populations whose ancestry traces back to consistently hot, often equatorial regions, certain communities across East Africa among the clearest examples, tend to show the reverse proportions almost exactly as the rule would predict. Notably long limbs relative to a comparatively slender torso, an efficient built-in radiator system for shedding excess heat rather than trapping it. Stand a body built for the punishing cold of the Arctic next to a body built for the relentless heat near the equator, and you're essentially looking at two different engineering solutions to two completely opposite thermal problems, both perfectly rational, both quietly shaped by nothing more dramatic than a few hundred generations of ordinary survival. Each one a physical argument won slowly without a single word ever being spoken in the debate. I do want to be honest about the limits of this pattern too, because tidy rules rarely stay perfectly tidy once researchers actually go looking closely enough. Newman's own research back in the 1950s found real exceptions even within the cold-adapted populations he was studying, certain groups whose body size did not track quite as neatly with the local climate as the rule would predict. And other researchers have noted the pattern holds far more consistently across Europe and Asia than it does across parts of sub-Saharan Africa, where body size variation seems to answer to a more complicated mix of pressures beyond temperature alone, including local disease exposure, available nutrition, and other factors researchers are still working to fully untangle. Biology, once again tonight, turns out to prefer a general tendency over an ironclad law, bending toward exceptions whenever local circumstances demanded something a little different, refusing every single time to be reduced to a formula quite as clean as any textbook chapter heading might suggest. None of this stays locked away in academic journals either. Researchers designing cold weather gear for polar expeditions and military deployments in Arctic conditions have leaned on exactly this kind of body proportion data since a jacket or a boot cut for an average build from a temperate climate will not necessarily sit properly or insulate properly on a body built along different proportions entirely. Something as seemingly unrelated as glove-sizing standards traces its logic straight back to the same physics Bergman and Allen were describing more than a century ago, long before anyone had a reason to think their observations about animals in general would ever end up mattering to a supply officer packing gear for a research station near the pole. There is one more thread worth pulling on before we move past this, because it reaches back to a conversation we already had tonight about a very different, much older population entirely. Neanderthals adapted to European cold for hundreds of thousands of years, an even longer stretch of time than any modern human population has had to work with, show this exact same pattern taken to something of an extreme, a notably barrel-shaped rib cage, a wide pelvis, and distinctly short forearms and shins relative to their overall height, even more pronounced than what shows up in modern, cold-adapted populations today. Their entire skeleton, in other words, looks almost like a more intensified rough draft of the same cold-weather blueprint modern Arctic populations carry refined across a far longer stretch of brutal winters than any of us have inherited. It is almost as though an ancient cousin species ran the exact same evolutionary experiment first given considerably more time to work with, arriving at a similar answer pushed just slightly further along the same trajectory. I find something quietly reassuring in that thought if I am honest with you sitting here at the end of a long night of stories. So much of what feels permanent about the human body, the shape we see reflected in a mirror every single morning, without much thought at all, turns out to be a slow, patient negotiation between an organism and its climate carried out across thousands of generations by people who never once knew they were negotiating anything. Nobody chose their proportions on purpose. Nobody voted on the ideal ratio of limb length to torso length at some ancient meeting around a fire. Cold, indifferent physics simply kept rewarding whichever bodies happened to hold on to warmth a little more efficiently than their neighbours, generation after generation, until an entire population silhouette had quietly shifted, without anyone ever deciding it should. Your own build, whatever it happens to be, carries a small trace of that same ancient negotiation somewhere inside it. Whether your ancestors spent their winters buried in snow, or their afternoons baking under equatorial sun, it is not destiny, and it is certainly not the whole story of who you are. But it is a real thread quietly stitched into the architecture of your own skeleton, connecting you backward through more winters and more summers than any family history could ever hope to count. But body shape and proportion were never the only inheritance climate left etched into the outside of a person. There is one more feature left to explore tonight, and it might be the most visually striking difference of them all. A story about why one side of the old world ended up wearing an entire rainbow of colours across its hair and eyes, while the other side settled almost universally on the exact same shade. A difference you can spot from clear across a crowded room without a single test or measurement required. Walk through any city in East Asia and take a careful look at hair and eyes as people pass by on a busy sidewalk. You will find black hair and brown eyes showing up again and again, population after population, with a consistency that borders on the absolute somewhere north of 99% by most estimates. Now picture a market square somewhere in northern or eastern Europe, instead crowded on a Saturday morning with people picking through stalls of bread and cut flowers. Blonde hair standing next to red, standing next to deep brown, standing next to black. Eyes shifting between blue, green, grey, hazel and brown, sometimes within the very same family gathered around the very same dinner table. Siblings who share every meal of their childhood, somehow ending up with eyes that barely resemble each other at all. Two regions of the old world, both populated by the same species, and one of them settled almost entirely on a single look, while the other apparently could not stop reinventing itself. That contrast is not some minor curiosity researchers stumbled across by accident. It sits near the top of the list of genuine puzzles in human pigmentation research, and the explanation on offer, while far from universally settled, happens to be one of the stranger and more human stories in this whole field. Let us start with the raw genetics, because the diversity itself runs deeper than most people realize. Take hair color alone. Researchers studying a gene called MC1R, already familiar to anyone who has looked into red hair, specifically have identified at least 7 distinct versions of that gene contributing to hair color variation. And remarkably, these particular versions show up almost exclusively in European populations. Eye color diversity, meanwhile, traces us back to an entirely separate set of genetic variants, only weakly connected to whichever versions of MC1R a person happens to carry. In other words, hair color and eye color in Europe are not one unified story wearing 2 faces. They're 2 largely independent genetic threads that both happen to diversify dramatically across the exact same stretch of the map at roughly the exact same period in history. Red hair makes for the most striking single example of just how rare this kind of diversification really is, even within Europe itself. Fewer than 2% of people worldwide carry it concentrated overwhelmingly in populations tracing back to Scotland and Ireland, where certain regions still see it show up in well over 10% of the population, a truly tiny sliver of humanity, carrying a trait recessive enough that it can disappear from a family line for generations before quietly resurfacing in a child neither parent expected. Here is where the timing becomes honestly strange and worth sitting with for a moment. Populations across East Asia carry overwhelmingly uniform dark hair and dark eyes, which places a hard boundary on how far back this European diversification could possibly stretch. If the ancestors of Europeans and East Asians already shared one dark uniform look before their population split apart, then whatever process eventually produced Europe's rainbow of colours had to happen sometime after that split, not before it. Researchers estimate that split occurred somewhere in the neighbourhood of 20,000 years before now, which leaves at the very most a window of roughly 14,000 years for an entire continent to go from one shared dark colouring to the wildly varied palette we recognise today. 14,000 years sounds like an enormous stretch of time sitting here in a warm room tonight, and in most contexts it certainly is. But for a trait as biologically stubborn as pigmentation, it is startlingly fast, and researchers have a truly useful comparison to prove exactly how fast. Populations descended from the earliest people to cross into the Americas have lived across an almost unbelievable range of environments over a comparable stretch of time, roughly 15,000 years from the brutal Arctic cold of the far north, down through deserts, rainforests, and mountain plateaus stretching all the way to the tip of South America. And across all of that environmental extremity, hair, eye, and skin colour among indigenous American populations never diversified anywhere near the degree Europe managed in a similar window. Time and environmental range alone, in other words, do not appear to be sufficient explanations on their own. Something else was clearly happening across Ice Age Europe, specifically something considerably more particular than simply waiting around long enough. Have you ever actually stopped to count how many different hair and eye colours show up in your own extended family, and wondered why that palette even exists at all, when so much of the rest of the world settled comfortably on one shared look generations ago? Tell me down in the comments what colours run through your own family tree, because I suspect most of you have never really tallied it up before tonight, and it might surprise you how varied it actually is once you start counting properly. The leading explanation for what actually happened comes from a researcher named Peter Frost, a Canadian anthropologist who laid out his case in detail in a 2006 paper published in the journal Evolution and Human Behaviour, after years spent puzzling over exactly the same contrast we just walked through together. His proposal centres on something considerably more human than climate or diet, an unusual demographic squeeze created by the sheer danger of survival across the open steppe and tundra of Ice Age northern and eastern Europe. Hunting large game across that kind of exposed, unforgiving terrain was extraordinarily dangerous work, and it fell disproportionately on men generation after generation across thousands of years, tracking massive, unpredictable animals across open ground with nowhere to hide if a hunt went wrong. Frost's argument suggests that the resulting toll on male survival was severe and consistent enough to leave many communities with noticeably more marriage-age women than available men, an unusual reversal of the typical demographic pattern seen across most other human populations throughout history. And whenever a resource, in this case eligible partners, becomes scarce relative to demand competition, for it tends to intensify sharply among whoever is left doing the choosing, according to Frost's hypothesis that intensified competition played out visually through appearance itself. In a landscape where most women shared the same dark hair and dark eyes, everyone's ancestors had always carried anyone who happened to stand out through some rare, unusual shade of hair or eyes, may have drawn disproportionate attention in a competitive search for one of the relatively few available partners. Novelty itself became a kind of visual advantage, a decent working definition of what researchers call frequency-dependent selection, where a trait's rarity is precisely what makes it valuable. Rather than any inherent superiority, the trait carries on its own the same basic logic behind why a single unusual face tends to stand out instantly in a crowded room full of otherwise similar ones. Generation after generation, that dynamic could have kept pushing pigmentation further and further away from the ancestral baseline, scattering outward into an ever-widening range of blondes, reds, hazels, and blues, each new unusual shade briefly enjoying its own small advantage, simply for being unfamiliar before the next unusual shade came along to claim the same fleeting edge. You might reasonably be wondering right about now why the same story never played out across the equally frozen tundra stretching through ancient northern Asia. It is a fair question, and Frost addressed it directly. The steppe tundra environment across northern Asia extended considerably further north than its European counterparts, sitting further from the warming, moisture-bearing influence of the Atlantic Ocean, and by most reconstructions it was a harsher, less hospitable landscape, overall likely supporting smaller, more thinly scattered populations spread across a far larger territory. Whatever specific demographic conditions created Europe's unusual squeeze on marriageable men may simply never have developed to the same degree or in the same sustained way across that particular stretch of ancient Asia, where survival itself may have depended less on the kind of large, high-risk group hunting that seems to sit at the center of Frost's entire argument. It is also worth mentioning that although Frost's hypothesis centers specifically on selection pressure, acting on women competing for scarce male partners, the resulting genetic changes did not stay confined to one sex for long, because the genes involved in hair and eye color are only weakly linked to sex itself. Any shift favored among women would have spread naturally into the male population as well within a handful of generations, which is exactly why the diversity we see across Europe today shows up just as vividly among men as it does among women, rather than lingering as some strange sex-specific quirk. I want to be honest with you about where this hypothesis currently stands within the wider research community, because it deserves that honesty rather than being presented as settled fact. It remains a truly compelling explanation, elegant enough to explain both the unusual timing and the unusual geography of the pattern all at once. But it has also drawn real criticism from other researchers, some of whom argue the underlying demographic assumptions are difficult to test directly against solid archaeological evidence, and that the genetic case for such an extraordinarily rapid burst of diversification still needs firmer support before the debate can be considered closed. Skeletal remains from that far back in history are scarce enough and scattered widely enough across such a vast territory that reconstructing precise sex ratios among Ice Age hunting communities remains an inexact science, at best more educated inference than hard head count. This is very much an active, ongoing conversation happening in academic journals rather than a tidy, universally agreed upon conclusion, and I think that honesty matters more than pretending otherwise just to wrap the segment up neatly. There is something quietly poignant sitting underneath all of this if the hypothesis holds any water at all. An entire continent's now famous palette of hair and eye colour, the very look so often held up as a kind of aesthetic ideal in art and film and casual conversation for centuries, may ultimately trace back to hardship, rather than any grand design to dangerous hunts, early deaths and grieving communities left with more widows and unmarried daughters than husbands and sons. Beauty in this telling did not arrive as some triumphant flourish. It may have grown slowly and unglamorously directly out of loss, repeated across thousands of winters, by people who never once knew they were shaping anything beyond their own difficult, ordinary survival. Somewhere behind every unusually coloured pair of eyes you've ever admired, there may be an unrecorded story of a hunting party that never made it home, and a woman left standing at the edge of camp trying to catch the attention of whoever was left. I find myself thinking about that trade quietly sitting here near the end of tonight's journey. So many of the features we have wandered through together, hair, teeth, sweat glands, eye colour, nose shape, body proportion, ancient inherited blood, carry these hidden negotiations tucked inside them. Bargains struck between a population and whatever brutal circumstance happened to be pressing down on it at the time. None of it was ever really about beauty for its own sake, and none of it was ever really about deficiency either. It was always simply about survival dressed up afterward. Centuries later, in whatever language of admiration each culture eventually chose to use, long after anyone remembered the hardship that had actually written the pattern into the population in the first place. The next time someone compliments a stranger's unusual eye colour at a party, they are in a very real sense unknowingly echoing a preference first formed on a frozen, dangerous plain thousands of years before either of them was ever born. But not every difference we have covered tonight actually reaches back to ancient biology at all. Some of the most obvious, most talked about physical differences between people today turn out to have almost nothing to do with genetics whatsoever, a fact that surprises nearly everyone who hears it laid out properly for the first time, myself included the very first time I looked into it. And this next one might be the biggest surprise of the entire night, because it involves a difference people assume is written into ancestry as deeply as anything else we have discussed, when the real explanation turns out to be sitting somewhere else entirely. After spending this entire night walking through genes, mutations, and traits, stretching back tens of thousands of years, it would be easy to assume every visible difference between populations must trace back to some ancient story, just like the ones we've already covered. Height certainly feels like it should belong on that same list. People casually talk about it as though it was simply written into ancestry, the same way eye colour or hair texture is a fixed inheritance passed down quietly through the centuries, something you either got dealt at birth or did not. The real story turns out to be almost the opposite, and the clearest proof of that comes from an accidental experiment. History handed researchers on an entire divided nation a natural laboratory nobody actually set out to build. In 1945, at the end of the Second World War, the Korean peninsula was split along the 38th parallel, dividing one shared people, one shared language, one shared genetic pool into two separate countries that would spend the following decades moving in almost completely opposite directions. Ethnic Koreans make up the overwhelming majority of the population on both sides of that border, even today genetically, about as near to identical as any divided population researchers could hope to study. If height truly worked the way hair colour or eye colour does, rooted deep in ancient, slowly shifting genetics, you would expect North and South Korean populations to have remained roughly the same height as each other, since so little time has passed, and so little of the underlying genetic pool has actually changed. That is not remotely what happened. Researchers studying height data from both countries have documented a striking, steadily widening gap, opening up between the two populations, beginning specifically with birth cohorts from the late 1940s onward and growing more pronounced with each passing decade after that. By 1997, South Korean preschool children were measuring roughly 6 to 7 centimeters taller on average than their counterparts across the border. By 2002, that gap had stretched to around 8 centimeters. Some studies focused specifically on the most severe years found North Korean preschool children measuring as much as 13 centimeters shorter and several kilograms lighter than South Korean children the exact same age. Among adult men, researchers have documented a gap approaching nearly 3 full inches on average, an enormous difference for two populations who were within living memory, one single people sharing one single gene pool. Have you ever stopped to think about how strange that actually is? Two populations sharing nearly identical ancestry, growing visibly different heights within the span of just a few generations. Tell me down in the comments if you already knew about this particular divide, because in my experience, most people have never heard the actual numbers laid out this clearly before. So what actually happened? The explanation has nothing to do with genetics drifting apart and everything to do with what happened to two populations that used to share the exact same table. Beginning in the 1960s, South Korea underwent a period of extraordinarily rapid economic growth, transforming within a few decades from a poor, largely agricultural society into one of the wealthiest economies anywhere in the world. A transformation historians and economists still study closely as one of the fastest developmental turnarounds of the entire 20th century. That transformation brought steadily improving nutrition. Along with it, more protein, more consistent access to food across the full range of the population, and considerably better healthcare available to children during the exact years their bodies were doing the most growing. North Korea followed an entirely different path, remaining economically isolated and centrally controlled and struggling with serious sustained food shortages across multiple stretches of its modern history. The most devastating period arrived during the 1990s, when a severe famine, sometimes referred to inside the country, using a phrase that translates roughly to the arduous march, pushed large portions of the population into genuine, sustained malnutrition, a crisis serious enough that international aid organizations and researchers studying refugee populations have documented its physical toll in considerable detail in the years since. Children who lived through those years as infants and toddlers, the exact window researchers consider most critical for long-term physical growth, ended up permanently shorter as adults than they most likely would have been otherwise. Their bodies never given the raw nutritional material needed to reach whatever height they were originally capable of reaching. This gets at something important and honestly a little humbling about how height actually works. Detail that gets lost surprisingly often in casual conversation. Genetics does set a kind of ceiling and upper boundary of what is biologically possible for a given person to grow toward, inherited from parents, the same way eye color or nose shape is. But reaching that ceiling depends enormously on nutrition and health during a fairly narrow, unforgiving window of childhood, particularly the first 2 years of life, and again during the growth spurt of early adolescence. Miss that window through chronic malnutrition or repeated childhood illness, and the body typically never fully catches up later, no matter how much better conditions eventually become, no matter how much food arrives on the table once a person has already grown into an adult. The World Health Organization has a fairly blunt term for this outcome, describing severe early childhood stunting as largely irreversible once it has already taken hold. Korea is not even the only natural experiment history has handed researchers on exactly this question. When East and West Germany reunified after decades apart, researchers found a comparable, if less extreme pattern playing out on European soil this time rather than Asian soil. Men who had grown up under the different economic conditions of a divided Germany showed a real height gap between the two populations, East German men measuring shorter on average than their West German counterparts before reunification, one that gradually narrowed across the generations that followed, as living conditions across the formerly divided country slowly evened out into something closer to a shared standard. Different continent, different century, same underlying lesson, repeating itself with almost eerie consistency, as though history keeps quietly running the exact same experiment over and over just to make certain we eventually learn the lesson properly. Now here is where this particular story reaches directly back into the exact comparison we have spent this entire night exploring. Because a very similar pattern, though, driven by an entirely different set of historical circumstances, played out across 20th century Japan as well. Japan's own Ministry of Education has kept detailed annual data on school children's height and weight going back to 1900, and those archives tell a truly dramatic story on their own. In 1926, the average 17-year-old Japanese boy stood about 160.5 centimeters tall. By 2024, that same average had climbed to roughly 170.8 centimeters, an increase of just over 10 centimeters across less than a century. The same archives even capture the damage done by wartime food shortages directly, showing average height actually dipping slightly in the years immediately following the Second World War before beginning its long, steady climb. Researchers point to a fairly clear set of causes behind that climb: expanded access to protein and dairy, the introduction of nationwide school lunch programs specifically designed to guarantee children a nutritionally complete meal regardless of their family circumstances, and dramatically improved general healthcare access across the entire population. South Korea, interestingly, followed a strikingly similar playbook around the same broader period, introducing its own nationwide school milk initiative in the 1970s, specifically aimed at boosting calcium and overall nutrient intake among growing children. A policy echo of exactly the same logic driving Japan's own post-war recovery just across the water. Interestingly, Japan's own upward climb largely leveled off by the middle of the 1990s, once nutrition across the country had essentially reached a point of sufficiency, suggesting the population was approaching whatever genetic ceiling its collective biology actually allows, rather than continuing to climb indefinitely the way a purely genetic story might have predicted. This same pattern on a smaller and considerably more personal scale plays out constantly among its immigrant families. Right here in the United States, something plenty of people watching tonight may have witnessed firsthand without ever connecting it to Ice Age genetics or Cold War history. Parents who grew up somewhere with more limited access to food or healthcare frequently watch their own children raised on a different continent entirely, with better nutrition and medical care, grow noticeably taller than they themselves ever did, sometimes standing a full head taller by the time that child reaches adulthood. Nobody's underlying genetic inheritance changed across that single generation. The environment surrounding the growing child simply did, and the body given the chance quietly took advantage of everything that improved circumstance had to offer. Sit with that comparison for a moment, because I think it deserves real weight rather than a passing mention. Anyone assuming height differences between European and Asian populations reflect some ancient fixed genetic divide is working from an outdated and honestly fairly shallow assumption, the kind of casual generalization that sounds reasonable at a dinner party, but falls apart the moment you actually check the numbers against real history. A huge portion of what people casually perceive as a height gap between populations has far less to do with deep ancestry than it does with nutrition, healthcare, and economic development. Across the last century alone, forces entirely capable of closing, narrowing, or even reversing within the span of 2 or 3 ordinary human generations. It is worth remembering that whenever a conversation about height, or frankly about any physical trait separating populations, starts leaning on assumptions rather than actual data, because the assumption is so often wrong in precisely this way. I do want to add one honest layer of nuance here, because good science rarely fits into a single tidy sentence. Height is truly substantially heritable within any single stable population, meaning if you compare people who grew up eating roughly the same diet under roughly the same conditions, genetics does explain a large share of why one person ends up taller than their neighbour. But that is a completely different statistical question from asking why one entire population's average height differs from another population's average height. Those two questions get confused constantly in casual conversation, and the Korean Peninsula happens to offer about as clean a real-world demonstration as science could ask for, proving that population-level height gaps can open up and, in principle, narrow again within a remarkably short stretch of history, all without a single meaningful shift in the underlying genetic pool. Are you taller than your own grandparents were at your age? I would guess quite a few of you watching right now actually are, sometimes by a surprising margin, once you actually stop and measure the difference honestly. And if that describes you, tell me down in the comments, because you are personally living proof of exactly the pattern we just spent time walking through together tonight. There is something quietly hopeful tucked inside this particular story, especially after a night spent tracing so many differences all the way back to ancient unchangeable genetic history. Not every visible difference between populations is written in stone or in deoxyribonucleic acid passed down since the Ice Age. Some differences are simply the fingerprint of recent history, of policy, of famine, of decades of hard-won economic progress, and history, unlike ancient genetics, remains something later. Generations still have some real power to reshape one generation of better nutrition, better healthcare, and a little more stability at a time. We have spent this entire night tracing one thread after another: hair and teeth, earwax and alcohol mutations, tens of thousands of years old, and famines barely one lifetime removed from us all, in service of one single sprawling question: why two branches of the same species ended up looking so different from each other after tens of thousands of years apart. Some of those answers reach back to a single ancient person standing near the Black Sea. Others reach back no further than a policy decision made within living memory. It is time now to gather every one of those threads together and see what they actually add up to when you finally step back and look at the whole tapestry at once. So let us actually do that. Let us step back all the way back past every gene and every mutation and every ancient skeleton. We spent the last several hours crouched over together and look at everything we picked up along the way, tonight laid out together on the table at once, the way you might finally spread out every souvenir from a long trip once you're back home and unpacking the last suitcase. It started with a single letter sitting quietly inside a gene called EDAR, a letter that decided how thick a person's hair grows, how many sweat glands cool their skin, even the faint shovel carved into the back of certain front teeth, a change so strong it showed up as one of the loudest signals of selection researchers had ever measured, later proven real by watching an ordinary laboratory mouse grow an entirely different coat because of it, right there in a research building thousands of years and thousands of miles removed from wherever that letter first appeared. From there we moved to something even smaller and stranger, a broken protein pump tucked inside a gland. Barely anyone thinks about deciding at once whether a person's earwax comes out wet or dry, and whether their body carries a scent at all. Discovered by a research team in Nagasaki, working backward from nothing more than old family patterns nobody had a name for. Patterns grandmothers had noticed for generations without ever knowing why. We followed a grain of rice into a 9,000-year-old clay jar and found an entire liver's worth of consequences waiting inside it, an enzyme running just a little too fast or a little too slow, deciding who turns red at a dinner table and who does not. A story that reached all the way back to a decision an entire civilization made about what to plant in the mud, long before anyone had a word for fermentation or fairness. We traced a single flicker of colour back to one specific person near the Black Sea, the shared ancestor of every ordinary blue eye alive today, and then watched that tidy story get quietly overturned by a skeleton in a Spanish cave who wore that same blue colour set into unmistakably dark skin. Proof that two traits we assumed arrived together had actually been telling two separate stories the entire time, patiently waiting thousands of years to finally be untangled from each other. We looked at two noses solving the exact same freezing problem in two completely different ways, one narrow and projecting, one broad and flat with a hidden architecture tucked behind it, neither population ever comparing notes across the vast frozen distance between them. We sat honestly inside a mystery science has not finished solving, yet a fold of skin at the corner of the eye that resists every tidy explanation offered so far. And I hope that unfinished feeling stuck with you the way it stuck with me, because not every question deserves a neat ribbon tied around it before its time. We uncovered a genuine paradox hiding in ordinary blood, an extinct cousin species that left more of itself in populations who never once set foot where it actually lived. The mystery quietly resolving itself, once researchers realized the real question was not who gained something, but who later lost a little of what they already had. We watched a mutation arrive shockingly late to a population that had already been milking cattle for thousands of years, discovered only once someone finally thought to check actual bones, instead of trusting a tidy assumption. We stood two herders from opposite ends of a continent side by side and watched their bodies shaped by the same brutal cold converge on almost the exact same proportions, despite never meeting the flip side of the very same evolutionary coin that split the story of the nose apart instead. We wondered why one side of the world kept every colour imaginable in its hair and eyes, while the other settled on one and sat with the uncomfortable possibility that beauty in this particular case may have grown out of loss rather than any grand design. And we ended by discovering that one of the most obvious differences people assume separates two populations' height itself often has almost nothing to do with ancient genetics at all, closing and reopening within the span of a single divided lifetime depending entirely on what happened to be on the dinner table. 11 completely different threads, and yet notice what keeps showing up underneath nearly every single one of them. A change almost too small to imagine. One letter, one protein, one person, one accident, one decision rippling outward across thousands of years until it became something you could see clearly across a crowded room without a single test required. Nothing about any of this was chosen. Nobody voted for a nose shape or an eye colour at some ancient gathering. Biology simply kept quietly rewarding whatever happened to work a little better than the alternative generation after patient generation, until an entire population's face, body and blood had shifted without a single person along the way ever realizing it was happening. Notice something else too now that all 11 threads are sitting side by side instead of scattered across a whole evening. Some of these stories pulled two populations apart into different solutions entirely, the nose leaning one way in Europe and another way across ancient Asia. Others pulled those same two populations quietly back together, the body finding almost the identical shape on both ends of a frozen continent, without either side ever comparing notes. Some traits trace back tens of thousands of years buried deep in the Ice Age. Others, like a height gap or a mutation for digesting milk, turn out to be shockingly recent, near enough to touch, practically still warm to the hand. And some of tonight's questions came with a tidy, satisfying answer, while others, like that stubborn fold of skin at the corner of an eye, are still sitting open on a researcher's desk somewhere tonight, waiting for the next piece of evidence to finally settle the argument. I want to take a moment to actually name some of the people who spent real careers chasing these threads down, because none of tonight's stories assembled themselves out of thin air. Pardis Sabetti and Yana Kambarov following one genetic signal all the way from a computer screen into a laboratory mouse's coat. Koichiro Yoshira's team in Nagasaki solving a mystery about earwax that turned out to reach into motherhood itself. Bing-Su tracing a single mutation back to the exact rice paddies that likely produced it. Hans Eiberg patiently building family tree after family tree until one impossible pattern finally clicked into place, and Carl's Laloué's a fox whose careful work on an old Spanish skeleton quietly rewrote what an entire field thought it already understood. Arslan Zaidi and Mark Shriver finally putting Arthur Thompson's century-old hunch about noses to a real modern test. Svante Pääbo spending a career piecing together an extinct species letter by letter until an entire species could finally hear its own family history spoken back to it. Todd Bersalieri and every researcher who eventually thought to check actual medieval bones rather than trusting a tidy assumption about milk. Marshall Newman measuring bodies across the Arctic decades before anyone had the tools to confirm what he suspected. Peter Frost willing to propose an explanation strange enough that people are still arguing about it today. All of them in their own particular corner of this enormous puzzle decided one small mystery was worth an entire career, sometimes decades spent on a single gene or a single skeleton, long unglamorous stretches of careful unremarkable work that the rest of us will never see. And because of that patience we got to spend tonight together, actually understanding a little more about our own reflections than we did a few hours ago. Here is what I keep coming back to sitting here near the very end of this journey with you. Every single trait we walk through tonight, every fold of skin, every strand of hair, every quiet difference in the shape of a nose or the length of an arm sits on top of something far larger and far more stubborn underneath it. However different two people might look standing side by side, the overwhelming majority of what makes each of them human sits completely unchanged between them. Identical, shared, inherited from the exact same handful of ancestors, deep enough in the past that the details we spent tonight exploring amount to little more than decoration layered on top of something profoundly the same. The differences are real. I would never tell you otherwise after everything we just spent hours walking through together. But they are also every single one of them remarkably small, written in single letters and modest percentages, sitting on top of an ocean of shared biology so much larger that it rarely gets any credit at all. If you printed out the entire genetic instruction manual for a human being, the differences separating any two people on this planet, however different their ancestry, would fit into a stretch of pages so short you could hold it between two fingers tucked away inside a book thick enough to fill an entire shelf. So the next time you catch your own reflection in a window late at night, or study the particular shape of a stranger's eyes on a crowded train, I hope some small part of tonight stays with you. Not a checklist of genes and mutations to recite, but a quieter kind of wonder, the knowledge that the face looking back at you carries an actual physical chronicle of ice, ages endured, famines, survived migrations undertaken by people who never once knew where their journey would eventually end, and ancient accidents that could have gone 1,000 different ways and simply happened to go this one instead. You did not choose any of it, neither did I. And somehow out of all that accumulated accident and hardship and quiet endurance, here we both are anyway, sharing one ordinary night together across whatever distance actually separates us. There is a particular kind of luck buried in that thought too, if you sit with it long enough. Every single ancestor standing between you and the very first humans had to survive long enough to have a child who also survived long enough to have a child, an unbroken chain stretching back further than anyone can properly picture. Through every famine, every ice age, every dangerous hunt, every difficult winter we talked about tonight. One broken link anywhere along that entire chain, and neither of us would be here to share this particular evening at all. That is not a small thing to carry quietly inside an ordinary body doing ordinary things on an ordinary night. Thank you for staying with me through all of it tonight, through 9,000 years of rice paddies and one lonely ancestor by the Black Sea. and a skeleton in a Spanish cave that upended an entire assumption in a single afternoon. I know there are 100 other places you could have spent these hours, other tabs open, other shows waiting, other easier ways to drift off tonight. I know that. And the fact that you chose to spend at least part of them here instead, listening to strangers turn out to be less strange than they first appeared, means more than a passing word of thanks can really capture. If any part of tonight followed you into your dreams in the gentlest, most restful way possible, then this was exactly the kind of evening I hope to give you. Rest well tonight, wherever you happen to be listening from. Let your shoulders finally drop the rest of the way down. There will be another story waiting whenever you are ready to come looking for it again. Another quiet thread of history pulled out into the light. Another reason to lie back, shut your eyes, and let your mind wander somewhere far older than tonight. Until then, sleep easy, and thank you truly for spending this particular night with me.